Far, far away, in a certain kingdom, in a certain empire, stood a city. And in this city reigned Tsar Goroch and the Tsaritsa Markovya. They had many wise boyars, rich princes, strong and mighty heroes, and of the common run of warriors 100,000 at least. All manner of people dwelt in this city, worshipful, well-bearded merchants, cunning, open-handed sharpers, German mechanics, Swedish beauties, drunken Russians. And in the suburbs beyond the town dwelt peasants who tilled the earth, sowed corn, ground it into meal, took it to the bazaar, and drank away their hard earnings. In one of these suburbs stood an old hut, and in this hut dwelt an old man with his 3 sons, Pachom, Thomas, and Ivan. The old man was not only sage, he was cunning, and whenever he chanced to come across the devil, he would have a chat with him, make him drunk, and worm many and great secrets out of him, and then would go away and do such wonders that some of his neighbors called him a wizard and a magician, while others honored him as a shrewd fellow who knew a thing or two. The old man certainly did great wonders. If anyone were being consumed by the flames of hopeless love, he had only to pay his respects to the wizard, and the old man would give him some sort of little carrot which would draw the fickle fair one at once. If anyone were lost, he would manage to get it back from the thief, however it might be hidden, by means of charmed water and a fishing net. But wise as the old man was, he could not persuade his sons to walk in his footsteps. 2 of them were great gadabouts, not because they were wise, but because they were thorough featherbrains. They never knew when to run forward or when to hold back, and they married and had children. The 3rd son was not married, but the old man did not trouble about him, because his 3rd son was a fool, quite a natural in fact, who couldn't count up to 3 but could only eat and drink and sleep and lie on the stove. What was the good of bothering about a fellow like that? He can manage to jog along of his own accord much better than a man of sense. And besides, Ivan was so mild and gentle that butter would not melt in his mouth. If you asked him for his girdle, he would give you his caftan also. If you took away his gloves, he would beg you to accept his cap into the bargain. Therefore they all liked Ivan and called him dear little Ivan or dear little fool. In short, he was a fool from his birth, but very lovable for all that. So our old man lived and lived with his sons till the hour came when he was to die. Then the old man called to him his 3 sons and said to them, "My dear children, my mortal hour has come, and you must fulfill my wish. Each of you must come with me into my tomb, and there pass a night with me. Thou first, Thomas, then thou, Pachom, and thou third, dear little fool Ivan." The 2 elders, like sensible people, promised to obey his words, but the fool promised nothing, but only scratched his head. The old man died. They buried him. They ate pancakes and honey cakes. They drank well, and on the first night it was for his eldest son Thomas to go into his tomb. Whether it was laziness or fear, I know not, but he said to little fool Ivan, "Tomorrow I have to get up early to grind corn. Go thou instead of me into our father's tomb." "All right," answered little fool Ivan, who took a crust of bread, went to the tomb, lay down, and began to snore. So it struck midnight, the tomb began to move, the wind blew, the midnight owl hooted, the tombstone rolled off, and the old man came out of his tomb and said, "Who's there?" "I," answered little fool Ivan. "Good," answered the old man. "My dear son, I'll reward thee for obeying me." Scarcely had he said these words when the cocks crew and the old man fell back into the tomb. Little fool Ivan went home and threw himself on the top of the stove, and his brother asked him, "Well, what happened?" "Nothing at all," said he. "I slept the whole night through. Only I am very hungry and want something to eat." The next night it was the turn of Pachom, the 2nd son, to go to the tomb of his father. He fell a-thinking, and at last he said to little fool Ivan, "I must get up very early tomorrow morning to go to market. Go thou instead of me to my father's tomb." "All right," replied little fool Ivan, who took a cake and some cabbage soup, went to the tomb and lay down to sleep. Midnight approached. The tomb began to shake, the tempest began to howl, a flock of ravens flew round and round it, the stone fell from the grave, the old man got out of the tomb and asked, "Who's there?" "I," answered little fool Ivan. "Good, my beloved son," replied the old man. "I'll not forget thee, because thou hast not disobeyed me." Scarcely had he uttered these words when the cocks began to crow, and the old man fell back in his tomb. Little fool Ivan awoke, made himself snug on his stove, and his brother asked him, "Well, what happened?" "Nothing at all," answered little Ivan. On the third night, the brother said to little fool Ivan, "Now 'tis thy turn to go to our father's tomb. A father's wish must be fulfilled." "By all means," answered little fool Ivan, who took a fritter, put on his blouse, and went to the tomb. And at midnight the gravestone was torn from the tomb, and the old man came out and asked, "Who's there?" "I," said little fool Ivan. "Good, my obedient son," answered the old man. "Not in vain hast thou obeyed my will. Thou shalt have a reward for thy faithful service." And then he shouted with a monstrous voice, and sang with a nightingale's piping voice, "Hi, thou Sivka Borka Vyashikaorka," or "Grizzled, dark brown, red brown, knowing steed, stand before me like the leaf before the grass." And it seemed to little fool Ivan as if a horse were running. The earth trembled beneath it. Its eyes burned like fire. Clouds of smoke poured out of its ears. It ran up, stood still as though it had taken root in the ground, and said with a human voice, "What dost thou require?" The old man got into one of its ears, cooled himself, washed himself, dressed himself finely, and came out of the other ear so young and handsome that there's no guessing or imagining it, for no pen can write nor tale can tell the like of it. "There, my dear son," said he, "thou hast my valiant steed, and thou, O horse, my good steed, serve him as thou hast served me." He had scarcely uttered these words when the crowing cocks of the village flapped their wings and sang their morning song. The magician sank back into his grave, and the grass grew over it. Little fool Ivan went home step by step. He got home, stretched himself in his old corner, and snored till the walls trembled. "What is it?" asked his brothers, but he never answered a word, but only waved his hand. And so they went on living together, the elder brothers like wise men, the younger like a fool. Thus they lived on, day by day, and just as a woman rolls thread into a ball, so their days rolled on till it came to their turn to be rolled. And one day they heard that the captains of the host were going all about the realm with trumpets and clarions and drums and cymbals. And they blew their trumpets and beat their drums and proclaimed in the bazaars and public places the Tsar's will. And the will of the Tsar was this. Tsar Goroch and Tsaritsa Morkovia had an only daughter, the Tsarevna Bakriana, the heiress to the throne, and so lovely that when she looked at the sun was ashamed, and when she regarded the moon was abashed. And the Tsar and the Tsaritsa thought to themselves, "To whom shall we give our daughter in marriage, that he may govern our realm, defend it in war, sit as judge in the royal council, help the Tsar in his old age, and succeed him at the end of his days?" The Tsar and the Tsaritsa sought for a bridegroom who was to be a valiant young warrior, a handsome hero, who was to love the Tsarevna and make the Tsarevna love him. But the love part of the business was not so easy, for there was this great difficulty. The Tsarevna loved nobody. If her father the Tsar began talking to her of any bridegroom, she always gave one and the same answer, "I don't love him." If her mother the Tsaritsa began talking to her about anyone, she always answered, "He is not nice." At last Tsar Goroch and Tsaritsa Morkovia said to her, "Dear daughter and darling child, more than thrice lovely Tsarevna Bakriana, it is now time for thee to choose a bridegroom. Look now, pray, the wooers, the royal and imperial ambassadors, are all here at our court. They have eaten all the cakes and drained our cellars dry, and still thou wilt not choose thee the beloved of thy heart." Then the Tsarevna said to them, "My sovereign papa and my sovereign mamma, I am sorry for your sorrow, and would fain obey your will, but let fate decide who is to be my beloved. Build me a terem 32 stories high with a little bow window at the top of it. I, the Tsarevna, will sit in this terem just beneath the window, and do you make a proclamation. Let all people come hither, Tsars, kings, Tsareviches, princes, mighty champions, and valiant youths. And whoever leaps up as high as my little window on his fiery steed and exchanges rings with me, he shall be my bridegroom, and your son and successor." The Tsar and the Tsaritsa followed out the words of their sage daughter. "Good," said they. They commanded to be built a costly terem of 32 layers of oak beams. They built it up and adorned it with curious carvings, and hung it all about with Venetian brocade, with pearly tapestries and cloth of gold, and made proclamations and sent forth carrier pigeons, and dispatched ambassadors to all kingdoms, summoning all men to assemble together in the empire of Tsar Goroch and Tsaritsa Morkovia. And whoever leaped on his proud steed as high as the 32 oaken beams, and exchanged rings with the Tsarevna Bakriana, he was to be her bridegroom and inherit the kingdom with her, whether he were a Tsar or a king, or a Tsarevich or a prince, or even nothing but a bold, free-handed Cossack with neither birth nor ancestry. The day was fixed. The people crowded into the meadows where the Tsarevna's harem was built as if sown with stars, and the Tsarevna herself sat beneath the window, arrayed in pearls and brocade and lace and the most precious of precious stones. The mob of people surged and roared like the great sea ocean. The Tsar and the Tsaritsa sat on their throne, and around them stood their grandees, their boyars, their captains, and their heroes. And the wooers of the Tsarevna Bakriana came and pranced and galloped, but when they saw the harem, their hearts died away within them. The youths tried their best. They ran, they bounded, they leaped, and fell back on the ground again like sheaves of barley to the amusement of the crowd. In those days, when the valiant wooers of the Tsarevna Baktriana were trying their best to win her, the brothers of little fool Ivan took it into their heads to go thither and see the fun. So they got them ready, and little fool Ivan said, "Take me with you too." "What, fool?" answered his brother. "Sit at home and look after the fowls. What hast thou got to do with it?" "You're right," said he, and he went to the fowl house and lay down there. But when his brethren had departed, little fool Ivan went into the open plain, onto the wide steppe, cried with a warrior's voice, and whistled with an heroic whistle. "Hi, thou Sivka Borka Vyashikaorka!" or "Grizzled, dark brown, red brown, knowing steed, stand before me like the leaf before the grass." And lo, the valiant charger came running up. The earth trembled, flames shot out of his eyes, and clouds of smoke from his ears. And it said with a human voice, "How can I serve thee?" Little fool Ivan crept into one ear, washed and combed himself, and crept out of the other ear so young and handsome that books cannot describe it, nor the eye of man bear the sight of it. And he sat him on his good horse, and struck its sturdy ribs with a whip of Samarkand silk, and his horse chafed and fumed and rose from the earth, higher than the standing woods, but lower than the moving cloud. And when it came to the large streams, it swam them, and when it came to the little streams, it brushed them away with its tail, and opened wide its legs for the mountains to pass between. And little fool Ivan leaped up to the harem of the Tsarevna Baktriana, rose like a bright falcon, leaped over 30 of the 32 beams of oak, and dashed along like a passing tempest. The people roared, "Hold him! Stop him!" The Tsar leaped up. The Tsaritsa cried, "Oh!" The people were astonished. The brothers of little fool Ivan returned home and said to each other, "That was something like a hero. He only missed 2 stories." "Why, that was I, brothers," said little fool Ivan. "Oh, thou indeed! Hold thy tongue, fool, and lie on the stove and eat cinder cakes." The next day the brothers of little fool Ivan again assembled at the Tsar's sports, and little fool Ivan said to them, "Take me with you." "Take thee, fool," said the brothers. "Just sit at home and keep the sparrows from the peas instead of a scarecrow. What hast thou to do with it?" "That's true," said he, went among the peas, sat down, and scared away the sparrows. But when his brothers had gone, little fool Ivan shuffled off into the open plain, into the wide steppe, and roared with a martial voice, and whistled shrilly with an heroic whistle, "Hi, thou Sivka Borka Vyashikaorka!" or "Grizzled, dark brown, red brown, knowing steed, stand before me like the leaf before the grass." And lo, his valiant steed came running, the earth trembled, sparks flew from beneath his prancing hoofs, a fire burned in his eyes, and smoke rolled in clouds from his ears. He said with a human voice, "What dost thou require?" Little fool Ivan crept into one of the horse's ears, and crept out of the other so young and comely that the like of it was never heard of in tales or seen in reality. And he sat on his brave horse and beat its iron ribs with a Circassian whip. And his horse chafed and fumed and rose from the earth, higher than the standing woods, lower than the moving clouds. At one bound it went a league of the ancient measure. At the second bound it whizzed across the broad river, and at the third bound it reached the Tarim. It rose into the air like an eagle into the sky, leaped as high as 31 of the 32 oaken beams, and flew past like a passing whirlwind. The people cried, "Hold him! Stop him!" The Tsar leaped from his seat. The Tsaritsa cried, "Oh!" The princes and the boyars stood there with gaping mouths. The brothers of little fool Ivan returned home and said to each other, "Why, that young warrior of today was even better than the warrior of yesterday. There was only one oak beam he could not reach." "Why, brothers, that was I," said little fool Ivan. "Hold thy tongue. Thou, indeed. Lie on the stove and don't talk bosh." On the third day, the brothers of little fool Ivan again made them ready to go to the great spectacle. But little fool Ivan said, "Take me with you." "A fool like thee," replied his brethren. "Just stay at home and mix the meal in the trough for the pigs. What art thou thinking of?" "As you please," said he, and went into the backyard and began to feed the swine and grunt along with them. But when his brothers had gone, little fool Ivan shambled off to the open plain, to the wide steppe, and howled with a martial voice and whistled as only heroes can whistle. "Hi, thou, grizzled dark-brown, red-brown, knowing steed! Stand before me like the leaf before the grass." And lo, the valiant charger came running, the earth trembled. Where it touched the ground with its foot, springs gushed forth, and where it struck the ground with its hoof, lakes appeared, and flames came from its eyes, and clouds of smoke welled from its ears. It cried with a human voice, "What dost thou require?" Little fool Ivan crept into one of his horse's ears, and crept out of the other a youthful warrior, so handsome that no lovely maiden ever dreamed the like of him in her dreams. And 100 sages meditating for 100 years could not have imagined it. He struck his horse on the backbone, drew tight the rein, sat in the saddle, and rushed away so swiftly that the fleeting wind could not overtake him, and the dear little house swallow could not vie with him. He flew like a cloud of the sky, his silver harness hissed and gleamed, his yellow locks floated in the wind. He flew toward the Tsarevna's Tarim, struck his horse about the ribs, and his horse leaped like a cruel serpent, and leaped as high as the 32 oaken beams. Little fool Ivan caught the Tsarevna Bactriana in his heroic hands, kissed her sugary lips, exchanged rings with her, and was borne as by a whirlwind into the meadow, overturning all that met him or stood in his way. The Tsarevna only just succeeded in fastening a diamond star on his forehead, and the mighty warrior had vanished. Tsar Gorokh leaped to his feet. The Tsaritsa Morkovia said, "Oh!" The Tsar's counselors wrung their hands one after another, but spake never a word. The brothers of little fool Ivan returned home and began to talk about and discuss the matter. "Well, the hero of today was the best of all. He is now the bridegroom of our Tsarevna. But who is he?" "Why, brothers, it was I," said little fool Ivan. "Hold thy tongue. Thou, indeed. Go and eat cinder cakes and toadstools, but keep thy tongue well between thy teeth." But Tsar Gorokh commanded them to surround the city with a strong watch, and let in everyone, but let out no one, and proclaimed that all people under pain of death, from the eldest to the youngest, were to come into the Tsar's courts and do homage, that it might appear on whose forehead was the diamond star which the Tsarevna had fastened to her bridegroom. From very early in the morning the people came crowding together. They looked at everybody's forehead, but there was no star, and no trace of a star. It was now dinner time, yet not a single table in the halls of the Tsar was laid for dinner. The brothers of little fool Ivan also came thither to show their foreheads at the Tsar's command, and Ivan said to them, "Take me with you." "Take thee," said the brothers. "Sit in thy corner and catch flies. But why hast thou tied thy forehead round with rags, or hast thou damaged it?" "Yesterday when thou went out," he said, "as I was gaping about, I struck my forehead against the door. The door took no hurt, but a big lump sprang out on my forehead." As soon as his brothers had gone, little fool Ivan passed right below the little window where the Tsarevna was sitting troubled at heart. The soldiers of the Tsar saw him and asked, "Why hast thou bound up thy forehead? Show it. Is there not a star on thy forehead?" Little fool Ivan would not let them look and withstood them. The soldiers began to make a to-do. The Tsarevna heard it and bade them bring little fool Ivan to her, took the clouts from his forehead, and behold, there was the star. She took little fool Ivan by the hand, led him to Tsar Gorokh, and said, "Look, dear sovereign papa, This is my intended bridegroom, and thy son-in-law and successor." There was nothing more to be said. The Tsar commanded the banquet to be made ready. They married little fool Ivan and the Tsarevna Baktriana. For 3 days they ate and drank and made merry, and amused themselves with all manner of amusements. The Tsar made the brothers of little fool Ivan captains of his host, and gave them a village and a large house apiece. The tale of it is soon told, but the deed thereof is not soon done. The brethren of little fool Ivan were wise, and when they grew rich, it is not strange that all men gave them out for wise men at once. And when the brethren of little fool Ivan became great people, they began to be proud and haughty, would not suffer men of low degree to come into their courtyards at all, and made even the old voevods and boyars, when they came to see them, take off their caps on the stairs. So the boyars came to Tsar Gorokh and said, "Sovereign Tsar, the brethren of thy son-in-law boast that they know where the apple tree grows that hath silver leaves and golden apples, and they want to get this apple tree for thee." The Tsar sent for the brethren of little fool Ivan, and told them that they might fetch for him this apple tree with the silver leaves and the golden apples. And as they had nothing to say, they were obliged to go. The Tsar bade them take horses from the royal stables for their journey, and they set out on their journey to find the apple tree with the silver leaves and the golden apples. And in those days little fool Ivan arose, took his old hack of a horse, sat on it with his face to the tail, and rode out of the city. He went into the open plain, seized his jade by the tail, threw it into the open field, and said, "Come, ye crows and kites, there is a breakfast for you." Then he called his good horse, crept in at one ear and out at the other, and his horse carried him to the east, where grew the apple tree with silver leaves and golden apples, on the silver waters by the golden sands. And he pulled it up by the roots, went back, and before he got to the town of Tsar Gorokh, he pitched his tent with its silver tent pole, and laid him down to rest. Now his brethren were going along by this road, their noses hung down, and they did not know what to say to the Tsar by way of excuse. And they saw the tent and the apple tree beside it, and they awoke little fool Ivan, and they began to bargain with him for it, and offered him 3 cartloads of silver. "The apple tree is mine, brothers. It was not sold and purchased, but bequeathed by will," said little fool Ivan to them. "Yet a will is no great matter. Cut off a toe from the right foot of each one of you, and I'll say done." The brothers laid their heads together, but there was nothing for it but to agree. So little fool Ivan cut off one of their toes apiece and gave them the apple tree, and they brought it to the Tsar and boasted mightily. "Behold, O Tsar," said they, "we have traveled far, we have suffered many hardships, but we have performed thy will." Tsar Gorokh was overjoyed. He made a great feast, bade them beat the drums, and play on the trumpets and pipes, and he rewarded the brothers of little fool Ivan, and gave them a city apiece, and praised their faithful service. Then the other voevods and boyars said to him, "It is not a very great service to bring the apple tree with silver leaves and golden apples. The brothers of thy son-in-law boast that they would go to the Caucasus, and fetch thee the swine with golden bristles, and silver teeth, and 20 sucking pigs." Tsar Gorokh sent for the brothers of little fool Ivan, and told them to bring him the swine with the golden bristles, and the silver teeth, and the 20 sucklings. And as they had nothing to say for themselves, they dared not disobey. So they went on their way to find for the Tsar's pleasure the little pig with the golden bristles, and the silver teeth, and the 20 sucklings. And at that very time little fool Ivan arose and saddled his cow, and sat upon it with his face to the tail, and went out of the city. He went into the open plain, seized his cow by the horn, threw her into the field, and cried, "Gallop along, ye grey wolves and pretty little foxes, here's a dinner for you." Then he called his good horse, and crept in at one ear and out at the other, and his horse bore him to lands of the south, and bore him into a dreary wood, where the little swine with the golden bristles was rooting up roots with its silver tusks, and 20 sucking pigs were running after her. Little fool Ivan threw a silk lasso over the little swine, strapped the sucklings to his saddle, turned back, and when he was not very far from the city of Gorokh, pitched his tent with a golden tent pole, and lay down to rest. Now his brothers were coming along that same way, and were wondering what they could say to the Tsar. Suddenly they saw the tent, and close by it, tied by the silken lasso, the little swine with the golden bristles, and the silver tusks, and the 20 sucklings. They awoke little fool Ivan, and began to bargain with him for the swine. "We'll give thee 3 sacks of precious stones," they cried. "The little swine is mine, brother," said little Ivan the fool. "It is not sold or purchased, but bequeathed by will. But a will is no great matter. Let each of you cut me off a finger from his hand, and I'll cry done." The brothers laid their heads together and talked the matter over. People can live without brains. Why not without fingers also, thought they. So they let little fool Ivan cut off a finger from each of them, and he gave them the swine, which they took to the Tsar, and they praised themselves more than ever. "Tsar," said they, "we have been beyond the distant sea, beyond the impenetrable woods, beyond the shifting sands. We have suffered cold and hunger, but we have fulfilled thy commands." The Tsar was overjoyed to have such faithful servants, gave a great banquet to all the world, rewarded the brethren of little fool Ivan, made them great boyars, and could not praise their services sufficiently. Then the other voevods and boyars came to him and said, "'Tis not such a very great service, O Tsar, to bring thee the little swine with the golden bristles and the silver tusk and the 20 sucklings. A swine's a swine all the world over, though it has got golden tusks. But the brethren of thy son-in-law boast that they can do a yet greater service. They say they can get thee from the stables of the serpent Goruinich, or dweller in the mountains, the golden-maned mare with the diamond hoofs." Tsar Gorok sent for the brethren of little fool Ivan, and bade them fetch him from the stables of the serpent Goruinich, the golden-maned mare with the diamond hoofs. Then the brothers of little fool Ivan began protesting that they had never said such words. But the Tsar would not listen to a word of it. "Take of my treasures without tale or count," said he, "and of my host as much as you will. Bring me hither the golden-maned mare. Ye are the first in my realm, but if you bring her not, I will again degrade you into ragamuffins." So these good warriors, these useful heroes departed, scarce able to drag one foot after another, and not knowing whither they were going. And in the selfsame time, little fool Ivan arose, sat astride his little stick, went out into the open plain, into the wide steppe, called his good horse, crept into one ear and out at the other, and his horse took him into the west country, toward the great island where the serpent Goruinich guarded in his iron stable, behind 7 bolts, behind 7 doors, the golden-maned mare with the diamond hoofs. The horse went on, near and far, high and low, and little fool Ivan arrived at the island, fought 3 days with the serpent till he killed it, spent 3 days more in bursting the locks and breaking the doors, took out the golden-maned mare by the mane, went back, and had not gone many miles when he stopped, pitched his tent with a diamond tent pole, and laid him down to rest. And behold, his brethren were coming along by the same way, and knew not what they should say to Tsar Gorok. All at once they felt the ground tremble. 'Twas the neighing of the golden-maned mare. They looked about them, and there was a little light like a candle burning in the dark distance. 'Twas the golden mane which burned like fire. They stopped, awoke little fool Ivan, and began to bargain with him for the mare. They said they would each give him a sack of precious stones. "The mare is mine, brothers. 'Tis not for purchase or sale, but was bequeathed by will." Said little fool Ivan, "However, a will is not such a great matter. Let each of you cut him an ear off, and I'll cry done." The brothers did not say him nay, but they let little fool Ivan cut off an ear from each one of them, and he gave them the mare with the golden mane and the diamond hoofs, and they puffed themselves out and talked big, and lied boastingly till it made your ears ache to hear them. "We went," said they to the Tsar, "beyond lands thrice 10, beyond the great sea ocean. We strove with the serpent Goruinich, and look, he bit off our ears. But for thy sake we recked not of life or goods, but would swim through rivers of blood, and would sacrifice limb and substance in thy service." In his joy, Tsar Gorok measured them out riches without number, made them the first of his boyars, and got ready such a feast that the royal kitchens were not big enough for it, though they cooked and roasted there 3 days, while the royal wine cellars ran dry. And at the banquet, Tsar Gorok placed one of the brethren of little fool Ivan at his right hand, and the other at his left. And the feast proceeded right merrily, and the guests had eaten themselves half full and drunk themselves half full, and were humming and buzzing like bees in a hive, when they saw entering the palace a gallant warrior, little fool Ivan, in just the same guise as when he had leaped as high as the 32 oaken beams. And when his brothers saw him, one of them nearly choked himself with a drop of wine from his beaker, and the other nearly suffocated himself with a bit of roast swan, and they wrung their hands, rolled their eyes, and could not utter a word. Little fool Ivan bowed low to his father-in-law, the Tsar, and told him how he had got the apple tree with the silver leaves and the golden apples, and after that the swine with the golden bristles and the silver tusks and the 20 sucklings, and after that the golden maned mare with the diamond hoofs, and he drew out the fingers and the toes and the ears for which he had sold them to his brethren. Then Tsar Goroch was very wroth, and stamped with his feet, and bade them drive out the brothers of little fool Ivan with broomsticks, and one of them he sent to tend his swine in the cattle yard, and the other he sent to look after the turkeys in the poultry yard. The little fool Ivan he set beside himself, and made him the chief over the boyars and the captain of the captains. And long did they feast together in gladness of heart, till everything was eaten and everything was drunk. And little fool Ivan began to rule the realm, and his rule was wise and terrible. And on the death of his father-in-law he took his place. His children were many, and his subjects loved him, and his neighbors feared him. But the Tsarina Bactriana was just as beautiful in her old age as when she was young. End of the tale of Little Fool Ivan. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. The Little Feather of Fennis the Bright Falcon, from Russian Fairy Tales by Peter Polevoi, translated by Robert Nisbet Bain, 1854-1909. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. The Little Feather of Fennis the Bright Falcon. Once upon a time there was an old widower who lived with his 3 daughters. The elder and the middle one were fond of show and finery, but the youngest only troubled herself about household affairs, although she was of a loveliness which no pen can describe and no tale can tell. One day the old man got ready to go to market in the town and said, "Now, my dear daughters, say, what shall I buy for you at the fair?" The eldest daughter said, "Buy me, dear dad, a new dress." The middle daughter said, "Buy me, dear dad, a silk kerchief." But the youngest daughter said, "Buy me, dear dad, a little scarlet flower." The old man went to the fair. He bought for his eldest daughter a new dress, for his middle daughter a silk kerchief, but though he searched the whole town through, he could not find a little scarlet flower. He was already on his way back when there met him a little old man, whom he knew not, and this little old man was carrying a little scarlet flower. Our old man was delighted, and he asked the stranger, "Sell me thy little scarlet flower, thou dear little old man." The old man answered him, "My little scarlet flower is not for sale. 'Tis mine by will, it has no price, and cannot be priced. But I'll let thee have it as a gift, if thou wilt marry thy youngest daughter to my son." "And who then is thy son, dear old man?" "My son is the good and valiant warrior youth, Fennis the Bright Falcon. By day he dwells in the sky beneath the high clouds, at night he descends to the earth as a lovely youth." Our old man fell a-thinking. If he did not take the little scarlet flower, he would grieve his daughter, and if he did take it, there was no knowing what sort of a match he would be making. He thought, and at last he took the little scarlet flower, for it occurred to him that if this Fennis the Bright Falcon, who was thus to be wedded to his daughter, did not please him, it would be possible to break the match off. But no sooner had the strange old man given him the little scarlet flower than he vanished from before his eyes, just as if he had never met him at all. The old man scratched his head and began to ponder still more earnestly. "I don't like the look of it at all," he said. And when he got home he gave his elder daughters their things, and his youngest daughter her little scarlet flower, and said to her, "I don't like thy little scarlet flower a bit, my daughter. I don't like it at all." "Wherefore so vexed at it, dear father?" quoth she. Then he stooped down and whispered in her ear, "The little scarlet flower of thine is willed away. It has no price, and money could not buy it me. I have married thee beforehand for it to the son of the strange old man whom I met in the way, to Fennis the Bright Falcon." And he told her everything that the old man had told him of his son. "Grieve not, dear father," said the daughter. "Judge not of my intended by the sight of thine eyes, for though he come a-flying, we shall love him all the same." And the lovely daughter shut herself up in her little gabled chamber, put her little scarlet flower in water, opened her window, and looked forth into the blue distance. Scarcely had the sun settled down behind the forest when, whence he came who knows, Fennis the bright falcon darted up in front of her little window. He had feathers like flowers, he lit upon the balustrade, fluttered into the little window, flopped down upon the floor, and turned into a goodly young warrior. The damsel was terrified, she very nearly screamed, but the good youth took her tenderly by the hand, looked tenderly into her eyes, and said, "Fear me not, my destined bride. Every evening until our marriage I will come flying to thee. Whenever thou placest in the window the little scarlet flower, I'll appear before thee. And here is a little feather out of my little wing, and whatever thou mayest desire, go but out on the balcony and wave this little feather, and immediately it will appear before thee." Then Fennis the bright falcon kissed his bride and fluttered out of the window again. And he found great favor in her eyes, and henceforth she placed the little scarlet flower in the window every evening, and so it was that whenever she placed it there, the goodly warrior youth, Fennis the bright falcon, came down to her. Thus a whole week passed by, and Sunday came round. The elder sisters decked themselves out to go to church, and attired themselves in their new things, and began to laugh at their younger sister. "What art thou going to wear?" said they. "Thou hast no new things at all." And she answered, "No, I have nothing, so I'll stay at home." But she bided her time, went out on the balcony, waved her flowery feather in the right direction, and, whence I know not, there appeared before her a crystal carriage and horses and servants in gold galloon, and they brought for her a splendid dress embroidered with precious stones. The lovely damsel sat in the carriage and went to church. When she entered the church, everyone looked at her and marveled at her beauty and her priceless splendor. "Some Tsarevna or other has come to our church, depend upon it," the good people whispered among themselves. When the service was over, our beauty got into her carriage and rolled home, got into the balcony, waved her flowery feather over her left shoulder, and in an instant the carriage and the servants and the rich garments had disappeared. The sisters came home and saw her sitting beneath the little window as before. "Oh, sister," cried they, "thou hast no idea what a lovely lady was at Mass this morning. 'Twas a thing marvelous to behold, but not to be described by pen or told in tales." 2 more weeks passed by, and 2 more Sundays, and the lovely damsel threw dust in the eyes of the people as before, and took in her sisters, her father, and all the other orthodox people. But on the last occasion, when she was taking off her finery, she forgot to take out of her hair her diamond pin. The elder sisters came from church and began to tell her about the lovely Tsarevna, and as their eyes fell upon her hair, they cried with one voice, "Ah, little sister, what is that thou hast got?" The lovely damsel cried also, and ran off into her little room beneath the gables. And from that time forth the sisters began to watch the damsel, and to listen of a night at her little room, and discovered and perceived how at dawn Fennis the bright falcon fluttered out of her little window and disappeared behind the dark woods. And the sisters thought evil of their younger sister, and they strewed pieces of broken glass onto the windowsill of their sister's little dormer chamber, and stuck sharp knives and needles there, that Fennis the bright falcon, when he lit down upon the window, might wound himself on the knives. And at night Fennis the bright falcon flew down and beat vainly with his wings, and beat again, but could not get through the little window, but only wounded himself on the knives and cut and tore his wings. And the bright falcon lamented and fluttered upward and cried to the fair damsel, "Farewell, lovely damsel, farewell, my betrothed. Thou shalt see me no more in thy little dormer chamber. Seek me in the land of thrice 9, in the empire of thrice 10. The way thither is far. Thou must wear out slippers of iron. Thou must break to pieces a staff of steel. Thou must fret away reins of stone before thou canst find me, good maiden." And at the selfsame hour a heavy sleep fell upon the damsel, and through her sleep she heard these words, yet could not awaken. In the morning she awoke, and lo, knives and needles were planted on the window-sill, and blood was trickling from them. All pale and distraught, she wrung her hands and cried, "Lo, my distresses have destroyed my darling beloved." And the same hour she packed up and started from the house, and went to seek her bright white love, Fennis the shining falcon. The damsel went on and on through many gloomy forests. She went through many dreary morasses. She went through many barren wildernesses. And at last she came to a certain wretched little hut. She tapped at the window and cried, "Host and hostess, shelter me, a poor damsel from the dark night." An old woman came out upon the threshold. "We crave thy pardon, lovely damsel. Whither art thou going, lovey-dovey?" "Alas, granny, I seek my beloved Fennis, the bright falcon. Wilt thou not tell me where to find him?" "Nay, I know not, but pray go to my middle sister, she will show thee the right way. And lest thou shouldst stray from the path, take this little ball. Whithersoever it rolls, thither will be thy way." The lovely damsel passed the night with the old woman, and on the morrow when she was departing, the old woman gave her a little gift. "Here," said she, "is a silver spinning board and a golden spindle. Thou wilt spin a spindleful of flax and draw out threads of gold. The time will come when my gift will be of service to thee." The damsel thanked her and followed the rolling ball. Whether 'twere a long time or a short matters not, but the ball rolled all the way to another little hut. The damsel knocked at the door, and the second old woman opened it. The old woman asked her questions, and said to her, "Thou hast still a long way to go, damsel, and it will be no light matter to find thy betrothed. But look now, when thou comest to my elder sister, she will be able to tell thee better than I can. But take this gift from me for thy journey, a silver saucer and a golden apple. The time will come when they will be of use to thee." The damsel passed the night in the hut, and then went on farther after the rolling ball. She went through the woods farther and farther, and at every step the woods grew blacker and denser, and the tops of the trees reached to the very sky. The ball rolled right up to the last hut. An old woman came out upon the threshold and invited the lovely damsel to take shelter from the dark night. The damsel told the old woman whither she was going and what she sought. "Thine is a bad business, my child," said the old woman. "Thy Fennis the bright falcon is betrothed to the Tsarevna oversea, and will shortly be married to her. When thou gettest out of the wood, onto the shores of the blue sea, sit on a little stone, take out thy silver spinning board and thy golden spindle, and sit down and spin. And the bride of Fennis the bright falcon will come out to thee, and will buy thy spindle from thee. But thou must take no money for it, only ask to see the flowery feathers of Fennis the bright falcon." The damsel went on farther, and the road grew lighter and lighter, and behold, there was the blue sea. Free and boundless it lay before her, and there, far, far away above the surface of the sea, bright as a burning fire, gleamed the golden summits of the marble palace halls. "Surely that is the realm of my betrothed, which is visible from afar," thought the lovely damsel. And she sat upon the little stone, took out her silver spinning board and her golden spindle, and began spinning flax and drawing golden thread out of it. And all at once she saw coming to her along the seashore a certain Tsarevna, with her nurses and her guards and her faithful servants. And she came up to her and watched her working, and began to bargain with her for her silver spinning board and her golden spindle. "I will give them to thee for nothing, Tsarevna, only let me look on Fennis the bright falcon." For a long time the Tsarevna would not consent, but at last she said, "Very well, come and look at him when he is lying down to rest after dinner, and drive the flies away from him." And she took from the damsel the silver spinning board and the golden spindle, and went to her terem, made Fennis the bright falcon drunk after dinner with a drink of magic venom, and then admitted the damsel when an unwakeable slumber had overpowered him. The damsel sat beside his pillow, and her tears flowed over him in streams. "Awake, arise, Fennis the bright falcon," said she to her love. "I, thy lovely damsel, have come to thee from afar. I have worn out slippers of iron, I have ground down a staff of steel, I have fretted away reins of stone. Everywhere and all times have I been seeking thee, my love." But Fennis the bright falcon slept on, nor knew nor felt that the lovely damsel was weeping and mourning over him. Then the Tsarevna also came in, and bade them lead out the lovely damsel, and awoke Fennis the bright falcon. "I have slept for so long," said he to his bride, "and yet it seemed to me as if someone had been here and wept and lamented over me." "Surely thou hast dreamt it in thy dreams," said the Tsarevna. "I myself was sitting here all the time, and suffered not the flies to light on thee." The next day the damsel again sat by the sea, and held in her hands the silver saucer, and rolled the little golden apple about on it. The Tsarevna came out walking again, went up to her, looked on, and said, "Sell me thy toy." "My toy is not merchandise, but an inheritance. Let me but look once more on Fennis the bright falcon, and thou shalt have it as a gift. "Very well. Come again in the evening and drive the flies away from my bridegroom." And again she gave Fennis the bright falcon a drink of magic sleeping venom, and admitted the lovely damsel to his pillow. And the lovely damsel began to weep over her love, and at last one of the burning tears fell from her eyes upon the cheeks. Then Fennis the bright falcon awoke from his heavy slumbers and cried, "Alas! Who was it who burned me?" "Oh, darling of my desires," said the lovely damsel, "I, thy maiden, have come to thee from afar. I have worn out shoes of iron, I have worn down staves of steel, I have gnawed away wafers of stone, and have sought thee everywhere, my beloved. This is the second day that I, thy damsel, have sorrowed over thee, and thou wakest not from thy slumber, nor made answer to my words." Then only did Fennis the bright falcon know his beloved again, and was so overjoyed that words cannot tell of it. And the damsel told him all that had happened, how her wicked sisters had envied her, how she had wandered from land to land, and how the Tsarevna had bartered him for toys. Fennis fell in love with her more than ever, kissed her on her sugary mouth, and bade them set the bells a-ringing without delay, and assemble the boyars and the princes and the men of every degree in the marketplace. And he began to ask them, "Tell me, good people, and answer me according to good sense, which bride ought I to take to wife, and shorten the sorrow of life? Her who sold me, or her who bought me back again?" And the people declared with one voice, "Her who bought thee back again." And Fennis the bright falcon did so. They crowned him at the altar the same day, in wedlock with the lovely damsel. The wedding was joyous and boisterous and magnificent. I also was at this wedding, and drank wine and mead, and the bumpers overflowed, and everyone had his fill, and the beard was wet when the mouth was dry. End of The Little Feather of Fennis the Bright Falcon. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. The Tale of the Peasant Demyan, from Russian Fairy Tales by Peter Polevoi. Translated by Robert Nisbet Bain, 1854 to 1909. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. The Tale of the Peasant Demyan. Whether it is a long time ago or a short time ago, I cannot say. But I know that once upon a time, in a certain village, dwelt a peasant who was headstrong and hot-tempered, and his name was Demyan. He was austere and hard and stern, always seeking an occasion to quarrel, and dealing hardly with whoever crossed him. Whatever anyone said or did to him, he was always ready with his fists. He would invite a neighbor to be his guest, for instance, and force him to eat. And if the neighbor hung back a bit for bashfulness or courtesy, our peasant would pitch into him at once and say, "In a strange house obey thy host." Now this is what happened one day. A smart, sturdy young fellow came to little Demyan as a guest, and our peasant regaled him finely and filled the table with meat and drink. The young fellow pulled everything toward himself, dish after dish, and munched away in silence with both cheeks crammed full. Our peasant stared and stared, and at last he took off his cloak and said, "Take off thy blouse and put on my cloak." But he thought to himself, he is sure to refuse, and then I'll show him something. But the youth put on the cloak, tied it round with his girdle, bowed low and said, "Well, little father, I thank thee for thy gift. I dare not refuse, for in a strange house one must obey the host." The host was furious. He wanted to pick a quarrel with him now at any price. So he ran into the stable, got out his best horse, and said to the youth, "Nothing is too good for thee. Here, mount my horse and take it away as thine own." But he thought, he'll be sure to refuse, and then I'll teach him a lesson. But the youth again said, "In a strange house we must always obey the host." Only when he was fairly mounted did he turn round to the peasant Demyan and cry, "Farewell, mine host. Nobody pushed thee, but thou didst fall into the ditch of thine own self." And he trotted out of the courtyard right away. But the host looked after him, shook his head, and said, "The scythe has struck upon a stone," or "I've met my match at last. End of the Tale of the Peasant Demyan. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. The Enchanted Ring, from Russian Fairy Tales by Peter Polevoi. Translated by Robert Nisbet Bain, 1854 to 1909. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. The Enchanted Ring. In a certain kingdom, in a certain empire, there lived once upon a time an old man and an old woman, and they had a son called little Martin. Time went on, the old man fell ill and died, and though he had worked hard all his days, the only inheritance he left behind him was 200 rubles. The old woman did not want to waste this money, but what was to be done? There was nothing to eat, so she had to have recourse to the pot containing the patrimony. The old woman counted out 100 rubles and sent her son to town to buy provision of bread for a whole year. So Martin the widow's son went to town. He went past the meat market and saw crowds of people gathered together, and his ears were deafened by the din and noise and racket. Little Martin went into the midst of the throng and saw that the butchers had caught a terrier and had fastened it to a post and were beating it unmercifully. Little Martin was sorry for the poor dog and said to the butchers, "My brothers, why do you beat the poor dog so unmercifully? Why should we not beat him when he has spoiled a whole quarter of beef? Yet beat him not, my brothers. 'Twere better to sell him to me." "Oh, buy him if you like then," said the butchers mockingly. "But for such a treasure as that, we could not take less than 100 rubles." "Well, 100 rubles is only 100 rubles after all," replied little Martin, and he drew out the money and gave it for the dog. The dog's name was Yurka, or Growler. Martin then went home, and his mother asked him, "What hast thou bought?" "Why, look, I have bought Yurka," replied her son. His mother fell a-scolding him and reproached him bitterly. "Art thou not ashamed? Soon we shall not have a morsel to eat, and thou hast gone and thrown away so much money on a pagan dog." The next day the old woman sent her son into the town again and said to him, "Now there is our last 100 rubles. Buy with it provision of bread. Today I will collect together the scrapings of the meal tub and bake us fritters, but tomorrow there will not even be that." Little Martin got to town and walked along the streets and looked about him, and he saw a boy who had fastened a cord round a cat's neck and was dragging it off to drown it. "Stop!" shrieked Martin. "Whither art thou dragging Vaska, pussy?" "I am dragging him off to be drowned." "Why, what has he done?" "He is a great rascal. He has stolen a whole goose." "Don't drown him. Far better sell him to me." "I'll take nothing less than 100 rubles." "Well, 100 rubles is only 100 rubles after all. Here, take the money." And he took Vaska from the boy. "What hast thou bought, my son?" asked his mother when he got home. "Why, the cat Vaska." "And what besides?" "Well, perhaps there's some money still left, and then we can buy something else." "Oh, oh, oh, what a fool thou art!" screeched the old woman. "Go out of the house this instant and beg thy bread from the stranger." Martin dared not gainsay his mother, so he took Yurka and Vaska with him and went into the neighboring village to seek work. And there met him a rich farmer. "Whither art thou going?" said he. "I want to hire myself out as a day laborer." "Come to me then. I take laborers without any contract, but if thou serve me well for a year, thou shalt not lose by it." Martin agreed, and for a whole year he worked for this farmer without ceasing. The time of payment came round. The farmer led Martin into the barn, showed him 2 full sacks, and said, "Take which thou wilt." Martin looked. In one of the sacks was riches, and the other sand, and he thought to himself, "That's not done without a reason. There's some trickery here. I'll take the sand. Something will come of it, no doubt." So Martin put the sack of sand on his back and went to seek another place. He went on and strayed into a dark and dreary wood. In the midst of the wood was a field, and on the field a fire was burning, and in the fire a maiden was sitting. And it was such a lovely maiden that it was a delight to look at her. And the beauty said to him, "Martin the widow's son, if thou wishest to find happiness, save me. Extinguish this flame with the sand which thou hast gotten for thy faithful service." "Well, really," thought Martin, "why should I go on dragging this load about on my shoulders? Far better to help a body with it." So he undid his sack and emptied all the sand on the fire. The fire immediately went out, but the lovely damsel turned into a serpent, bounded on to the bosom of the good youth, wound itself round his neck, and said, "Fear me not, Martin the widow's son. Go boldly into the land of thrice 10, into the underground realm where my dear father rules. Only mark this, he will offer thee gold and silver and precious stones. Thou, however, must take none of these, but beg him for the little ring off his little finger. That ring is no common ring. If thou move it from one hand to the other, 12 young heroes will immediately appear, and whatever thou dost bid them do, they will do in a single night." Then the young man set out on his long, long journey. Whether 'twere a long time or a short, I know not, but at last he drew nigh to the kingdom of thrice 10, and came to a place where a huge stone lay across the way. Here the snake leaped from his neck, lit on the damp ground, and turned into the lovely damsel. "Follow me," said she to Martin, and showed him a little hole beneath the stone. For a long time they went through this underground way, and came into a wide plain beneath the open sky. And in this plain a castle was built entirely of porphyry, with a roof of golden fish scales, with sharp-pointed golden pinnacles. "That's where my father lives, the Tsar of this underground region," said the lovely damsel to Martin. The wanderers entered the castle, and the Tsar met them kindly and made them welcome. "My dear daughter," said he to the lovely damsel, "I did not expect to see thee here. Where hast thou been wandering all these years?" "Dear father, in light of my eyes, I should have been lost altogether but for this good youth who saved me from an unavoidable death." The Tsar turned, looked with a friendly eye at Martin, and said to him, "I thank thee, good youth. I am ready to reward thee for thy good deeds with whatever thou desirest. Take of my gold and silver and precious stones as much as thy soul longs for." "I thank thee, sovereign Tsar, for thy good words, but I want no precious stones, nor silver, nor gold. But if thou of thy royal grace and favor wouldst indeed reward me, then give me, I pray, the ring from the little finger of thy royal hand. Whenever I look upon that ring, I'll think of thee. But if ever I meet with a bride after mine own heart, I will give it to her." The Tsar immediately took off the ring, gave it Martin, and said, "By all means, good youth, take the ring, and may it be to thy health. But mark this one thing, tell no one that this ring of thine is no common ring, or it will be to thy hurt and harm." Martin the widow's son thanked the Tsar, and took the ring, and returned by the same way through which he had reached the underground realm. He returned to his native place, sought out his old widowed mother, and lived and dwelt with her without either want or care. Yet for all the good life he led, Martin seemed sorrowful, and why should he not? For Martin wanted to marry, and the bride of his choice was not his like in birth, for she was a king's daughter. So he consulted his mother and sent her away as his matchmaker, and said to her, "Go to the king himself and woo for me the thrice lovely princess." "Alas, my dear son," said his old mother, "'twould be far better for thee if thou wert to chop thine own wood," that is, go about thine own errand. "But what art thou thinking of? How can I go to the king and ask him for his daughter for thee? 'Twould be as much as thy head and my head were worth." "Fear not, dear mother. If I send thee, thou mayest go boldly. And mind thou dost not come back from the king without an answer." So the old woman dragged herself to the royal palace. She went into the royal courtyard, and without being announced, she went right up to the very staircase of the king. The guards shook their arms at her as a sign that nobody was allowed to go there, but she did not trouble her head about that, and continued to creep up. Then all the royal lackeys came running up and took the old woman under the arms, and would have quite gently let her down again. But the old woman made such a to-do, and fell a-shrieking so loudly that it pierced through everything. And the king himself in his lofty carved palace heard the noise, and looked out of his little window into the courtyard, and saw his servants dragging an old woman down the staircase, and preventing her from entering the royal apartments, while the old woman was resisting and shrieking with all her might, "I won't go out! I have come to the king on a good errand!" The king commanded them to admit the old woman. The old woman entered the carved palace, and saw sitting in the front corner on the high carved throne, on cushions of purple velvet, the king in state, holding a council in the midst of his grandees and his counselors. The old woman invoked the aid of the holy icons, and bowed very low before the king. "What hast thou to say, old woman?" asked the king. Now lo, I have come to your majesty. Be not wroth at my words. I have come to your majesty as a matchmaker. Art thou in thy senses, old woman? Cried the king, and his brow was wrinkled with a frown. Nay, O father king, pray do not be angry. Pray give me an answer. You have the wares, a little daughter, a beauty. I have the purchaser, a young man, so wise, so cunning, a master of every trade, so that you could not find a better son-in-law. Tell me therefore straight out, will you give your daughter to my son? The king listened and listened to the old woman, and at first his frown was blacker than night, but he thought to himself, does it become me, a king, to be wroth with a silly old woman? And the royal counselors were amazed, for they saw the wrinkles on the king's forehead smoothing out, and the king looked at the old woman with a smile. If thy son is so cunning, and a master of every trade, let him build me within 24 hours a palace more gorgeous than my own, and let him hang a crystal bridge between this palace and my palace, and let luxuriant apple trees grow up all along this bridge, and let them bear silver and golden pippins, and let birds of paradise sing within these apple trees. And on the right-hand side of this crystal bridge, let him build a cathedral 5 stories high with golden pinnacles, where he may receive the wedding crown with my daughter, and where the marriage may be celebrated. But if thy son fulfill not all this, then for thy and his presumption I will have you both smeared with tar and rolled in feathers and down, and hanged up in cages in the marketplace as a laughingstock to all good people. And the king condescended to smile still more pleasantly, and his grandees and his counselors held their sides and rolled about the floor for laughter. And they began with one voice to praise his wisdom, and thought among themselves, what fun it will be to see the old woman and her son hung up in cages. 'Tis as plain as daylight. A beard will sooner grow out of the palm of his hand than he be able to accomplish so shrewd a task. The poor old woman was near to swooning. What, said she to the king, is this thy final sovereign word? Is this what I must say to my son? Yes, thus must thou say. If he accomplish this task, I will give him my daughter. If he do not accomplish it, I will put you both into cages. The poor old woman went home more dead than alive. She staggered from side to side and shed floods of scalding tears. When she saw Martin, she began screeching at him from afar. Did not I tell thee, my son, to go and chop thine own wood? Now thou seest that our poor little heads are lost. And she told her son all about it. Cheer up, mother, said little Martin. Pray to God and lie down to sleep. The morning is always wiser than the evening. But he himself went out of the hut, took his little ring from one hand and put it on the other. And the 12 youths immediately appeared before him and said, What dost thou require? He told them of the royal task, and the 12 youths answered, Tomorrow everything will be ready. The king awoke next morning, and lo, right in front of his palace towered another palace, and a crystal bridge led from one to the other. Along the sides of the bridge stood luxuriant apple trees, and upon them hung golden pippins, and birds of paradise were singing in the trees. And on the right hand of the bridge, blazing like fire in the sun, stood the cathedral with its golden pinnacles. And the bells of the cathedral were ringing and pealing in all directions. The king had to keep his word. He raised his son-in-law high in rank, gave him a rich inheritance with his daughter, and he took her to wife. Great was the wedding feast. The wine flowed in streams, and they drank of mead and beer, till they could drink no more. So Martin lived in his palace, and he ate of the best and drank of the best, and his life went as smoothly as cheese with butter. But the princess did not love him at heart, and when she reflected that they had not married her to the son of a czar, or the son of a king, or even to a prince from across the sea, but to simple Martin, the widow's son, her wrath waxed hot within her, and she fell a-thinking by what means she might best rid herself of a husband she hated. So she took care to caress him and flatter him, and waited upon him herself, and made him comfortable, and when they were quite alone she would ask him what it was that made him so wise and clever. And it happened one day that when he had been the king's guest, and had drunk and made merry with all his lords one after another, and had returned home and laid him down to rest, the princess came to him and caressed him, and coaxed him with wheedling words, and made him drunk with strong mead, and in that way found out what she wanted to know. for Martin told her all about his enchanted ring and showed her how to turn it. And no sooner was little Martin asleep and snoring than the princess took off the enchanted ring from his little finger, went forth into the broad courtyard, moved the ring from one finger to the other, and the 12 youths immediately appeared before her. "What is thy pleasure, and what is thy desire?" "That tomorrow morning there may be neither palace nor bridge nor cathedral on this spot, but only a wretched little hut as heretofore, and cast this drunkard into it, but remove me far from him into the empire of thrice 10. "It shall be done," replied the 12 youths with one voice. In the morning, when the king awoke, he felt inclined to go and pay a visit to his son-in-law and his daughter. So he went out upon the balcony, and lo, there was neither palace nor bridge nor cathedral nor garden. In place of them stood a wretched old hut, leaning on one side and scarce able to stand at all. The king sent for his son-in-law and began asking him what it all meant. Little Martin could only stare blankly at him without uttering a word. And the king bade them sit in judgment on his son-in-law for deceiving him by magic and destroying his daughter, the thrice lovely princess. And they condemned Martin to be put on the top of a lofty stone column with nothing to eat or drink. There he was to be left to die of hunger. Then it was that Yorka and Vaska remembered how little Martin had saved them from an evil death, and they came and laid their heads together about it. Yorka growled and snarled, and was ready to tear everyone to bits for his master's sake. But Vaska purred and hummed, and scratched himself behind the ear with his velvet paw, and began to think the matter over. And the artful cat hit upon a plan and said to Yorka, "Let us go for a walk about the town. And as soon as we meet a roll baker with a tin on his head, you run between his legs and knock the tin off his head, and I'll be close behind and immediately seize the rolls and take them to master." No sooner said than done. Yorka and the cat took a run into the town, and they met a roll baker. He was carrying a tin on his head, and he looked about him on all sides and cried with a loud voice, hot rolls, fresh from the oven." Yorka ran between his legs, the baker stumbled, the tin fell, and all the rolls were scattered about. But while the angry baker was chasing Yorka, Vaska hid all the rolls in the hedges. Then the cat and Yorka ran to the tower where Martin was placed, dragged with them the stores of bread, and Vaska scrambled up to the top, looked in at the little window, called to his master and said, "Alive, eh?" "Scarcely alive," replied little Martin. "I am quite exhausted from want of food, and it will not be long before I die of hunger." "Don't grieve. Wait a bit and we'll feed you," said Vaska. And he began to drag the food up from below, rolls and cakes and all kinds of bread, till he had dragged up for his master a large store. Then he said, "Master, Yorka and I will go to the kingdom of thrice 10 and get you back your enchanted ring. Take care to make the bread last till we return." Then they both took leave of their master and departed on their long journey. They ran on, and they smelt out the scent everywhere and followed it, paid great attention to what people told them, carefully made friends with all the other dogs and cats they met, asked about the princess, and found out at last that they were not far from the kingdom of thrice 10, whither she had told the 12 youths to carry her. They ran into the kingdom, went to the palace, and made friends with all the dogs and cats there, asked them all about the princess's ways, and turned the conversation to the subject of the enchanted ring, but no one could give them certain information about it. But one day it happened that Vaska went a-hunting in the royal cellars. There he waylaid a big fat mouse, threw himself upon it, dug his cruel claws into it, and was going to begin with its head when the big mouse spoke to him. "Dear little Vaska, don't hurt me, don't kill me. Perhaps I may be of service to you. I'll do all I can for you. But if you kill me, the mouse czar, all my mousy tsardom will fall to pieces." "Very well," said Vaska, "I'll spare you, but this is a service you must do me. In this palace dwells the princess, the wicked wife of our master. She has stolen from him his wonder-working ring. Till you have got me that ring, I will not let you out of my claws under any pretense whatsoever." "Agreed," said the mouse tsar, "I'll try." And he piped and whistled all his people together. A countless multitude of mice assembled, both small and great, and they sat all round the cat Vaska, and waited to hear what the mouse tsar would say to them from beneath Vaska's claws. And the mouse tsar said to them, "Whichever of you shall get the wonder-working ring from the princess He will save me from a cruel death, and I will raise him to the highest place about my person." Then a little mouse rose up and said, "I have often been in the princess's bedchamber, and I've noticed that the princess's eye rests more often on a certain little ring than on anything else. In the daytime she wears it on her little finger, but at night she stuffs it into her mouth behind her cheeks. If you wait a bit, I'll get you that ring." And the little mouse ran into the princess's bedchamber and waited till night. And as soon as ever the princess was asleep, it wriggled into her bed, picked the down out of her swan-feathered bolster, and strewed it all about under her nose. The fine down went up the princess's nose and into her mouth. She sprang up and began to sneeze and cough, and out flew the enchanted ring onto the counterpane. The little mouse immediately snatched it up and ran off with it to save the life of the mouse tsar. Vaska and Yurka set off to bring their master the wonder-working ring. Whether they took a long time or a short time matters not, but they arrived at last, and ran to the tower in which Martin was put to die from starvation. The cat immediately climbed up to the window and called to its master, "Art thou alive, Martin the widow's son? I am scarce able to keep body and soul together. This is the 3rd day I have been sitting here without bread." "Well, thy woes are over now. There will be a feast in your street now. That is, it will be your turn to triumph now. We have brought you your ring." Martin was overjoyed and began to stroke the cat, and the cat rubbed itself against him and began purring its own little songs through its nose. But at the bottom of the tower, Yurka was leaping and whining and barking for joy and leaping high in the air. Martin took the ring and turned it from one hand to the other. The 12 youths immediately appeared. "What is thy pleasure, and what thy command?" "Give me to eat and drink, till I can eat and drink no more, and let cunning music be played on the top of this tower to me all day." When the music began to play, the good folk hastened to the king and told him that little Martin was up to no good in the tower there. "He ought to have ceased to be among the living long ago," they said, "and yet he is having such a merry time of it on the top of the tower. They are stamping with their feet and knocking their plates and clashing their glasses, and such splendid music is playing that you can't help listening to it." The king sent an express messenger to the tower, and there he stood and listened to the music. The king sent his highest officer, and there they all remained standing and opened wide their ears. The king himself went to the tower, and the music seemed to turn him into a statue. But little Martin again called his 12 youths and said to them, "Restore my old palace as it was before. Throw a crystal bridge across from it to the royal palace. Let the former 5-storied cathedral stand by the side of the palace, and let my faithless wife also be found in the palace." And while he was yet expressing the wish, the whole thing was done. And he went out of the tower, took his father-in-law the king by the hand, led him into the palace, led him up to the sleeping chamber, where the princess, in fear and trembling, awaited an evil death, and said to the king, "My dear little father-in-law, a great deal of trouble and anguish has befallen me from marrying thy daughter. What shall we sentence her to?" "My dear son-in-law, let mercy prevail over justice. Exhort her with good words, and live with her as heretofore." And Martin listened to his father-in-law, upbraided his wife for her treachery, and to the end of his life he never parted with the ring, nor with Yurka and Vaska, and saw no more misery. End of The Enchanted Ring. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. The Brave Laborer, from Russian Fairy Tales by Peter Polevoi. Translated by Robert Nisbet Bain, 1854 to 1909. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. The Brave Laborer. A young fellow entered the service of a miller. The miller sent him to throw grain on the scoop, but the laborer, not knowing how to set about it, went and strewed the wheat on the millstone. The mill wheel went round, and all the grain was scattered about. The master miller, when he came to the mill and saw the scattered grain, sent the workman about his business. The workman went home and thought to himself, "Well, I haven't been very long working at the mill." He went on his way thinking to himself, and so he missed the way to his own village. He strayed among the bushes and wandered about till he came to a stream. and on the stream stood an empty mill, and in this mill he resolved to pass the night. The dumb midnight hour approached. The laborer could not sleep in the empty mill. He listened to every rustling sound, and suddenly it was as though he heard someone approaching the mill. The poor laborer started up more dead than alive and hid himself in the scoop. 3 men entered the mill. Judging from their appearance, they were no good people, but robbers. They lit a fire in the mill and began to divide among themselves a rich booty. And one of the robbers said to the others, "I will lay my portion underneath the mill." The second said, "I'll place mine underneath the wheel." But the third said, "I'll conceal my goods in the scoop." But our laborer was lying in the scoop, and he thought, "No man can die twice, but every man must die once. I wonder now if I can frighten them. Let us try." And he roared at the top of his voice, "Dennis, you come down there. And you, Focus, look on that side. And you, little one, look there and I'll be here. Stop them, don't let them go, and beat them without mercy." The robbers were terrified, threw down their booty, took to their heels straightway, and the laborer took their booty and returned home richer than rich. End of The Brave Laborer, recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. The Sage Damsel, from Russian Fairy Tales by Peter Polevoi, translated by Robert Nisbet Bain, 1854 to 1909. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. The Sage Damsel. An old man and an old woman died, and left behind them a son young in years, who was rich neither in wits nor goods. His uncle took him home, gave him to eat and drink, and when he grew up, sent him to watch the sheep. And one day he sent for his kinsman and resolved to test his wits. So he said to him, "Here, thou hast a flock of sheep. Drive them to market and make profit out of them in such a way that both thou and the sheep shall get fat upon it, and the sheep be all brought back whole, and yet all to the very last one be sold for ready money." "How is that to be managed?" thought the orphan, who drove the sheep into the open field, sat by the roadside, and fell a-thinking. A lovely damsel passed by that way, and she said to him, "Of what art thou thinking, good youth?" "Why should I not be thinking? My uncle has taken a spite at last against me, a poor orphan. He has given me a task to do, and cudgel my brains as I may, I cannot see how it is to be done." "What task has he given thee?" "Well, look you. He says, go to market, drive those sheep thither, and make a profit out of them, but so that thou and the sheep shall grow fat upon it, and the sheep be brought back whole, all down to the last one, and yet be sold for ready money." "Well, that's no very tricky task," replied the damsel. "Shear the sheep, take the fleeces to market and sell them, then thou wilt make a profit out of them, and the sheep will remain whole, and thou wilt be able to feed thyself on the profits." The youth thanked the damsel and did as she said. He sheared the sheep, sold their fleeces at the market, drove home the flock, and gave the money he had made out of them to his uncle. "Good," said the uncle to the nephew, "but I am sure thou didst not work this out with thine own wits, eh? Didn't someone or other teach it thee?" The youth confessed, "Well, I certainly did not do it by my own wits, but a lovely damsel came by and taught me." "Well then, thou must take this sage young damsel to wife. 'Twill be a very good thing for thee, but here art thou an orphan, with neither stick nor stone of thy own, and nothing much in the way of wits either." "I don't mind if I do marry her," said the nephew to his uncle. "All right, but thou must render me this one service. Take corn to town to the bazaar. According as thou dost sell it and return again, I'll wed thee to this damsel." So the nephew went to town to sell the uncle's corn, and on the way he met a rich miller. "Why art thou off to town?" said the miller. "I'm going to the bazaar to sell my uncle's corn." "Then we'll go to town together." So they went along the road together, the miller in his gig with his plump brown horse, and the orphan in his little cart with his thin grey mare. They encamped side by side in the open field to pass the night there, took out the horses, and themselves lay down to sleep. And it happened that self-same night that the grey mare had a foal. The rich miller woke earlier than the orphan, saw the foal, and drove him beneath his gig. When the orphan awoke, a hot dispute arose between them. The orphan said, "It is my foal because it belongs to my mare." The covetous miller said, "No, 'tis mine, because it was born beneath my gig. They wrangled and wrangled till they resolved to go to law about it, and when they arrived in town they went to the court to fight the matter out there. And the judge said to them, "In our town we have introduced this custom into the tribunals, that whoever wants to go to law must first of all guess 4 riddles. So tell me now, what is the strongest and swiftest thing in the world? What is the fattest thing in the world? And what is the softest and what the sweetest of all?" The judge gave them 3 days to guess, and said, "If you guess my riddles, I will judge betwixt you according to law. But if not, don't be angry if I drive you away." The rich miller went to his wife and told her how the matter stood, and what riddles the judge had given him to guess. "All thy riddles are but simple ones," replied the miller's wife. "If they ask thee what is the strongest and swiftest thing in the world, tell them that my father has a dark brown horse, so strong and nimble that it can run down a hare. And if they ask thee what is the fattest thing in the world, dost thou not know that in our stall we are fattening up a 2-year-old boar, and he's getting so fat that his very legs won't be able to hold him up? And as for the third riddle, what is the softest thing in the world? Why, it's quite plain that that's a down pillow. Thou canst not imagine anything softer than that. And if they ask thee what is the sweetest thing in the world, say, why, what sweeter thing can a man have than the wife of his bosom?" But the orphan went out of the town into the fields and sat by the roadside and racked his brain. He sat and thought of his misery. And along the road, close to him, passed the self-same lovely damsel. "Why art thou so racking thy brains again, good youth?" "Why, look you, the judge has given me 4 such riddles to guess that I shall never be able to guess them all my days." And he told the damsel all about it. The damsel laughed and said to him, "Go to the judge and say to him that the strongest and swiftest thing in the world is the wind, that the fattest of all is the earth, for she feeds everything that lives and grows upon her, the softest of all is the palm of the hand, for however soft a man may lie, he always puts his hand beneath his head, and there's nothing sweeter in the whole world than sleep." The poor little orphan bowed to the very girdle to the damsel, and said to her, "I thank thee, thou sagest of maidens, for thou hast snatched me from very ruin." When the 3 days had passed, the miller and the orphan appeared in court, and told the court the answers to the riddles. Now the Tsar chanced to be on the bench at that time, and the answers of the orphan so pleased him that he ordered that the cause between them should be given in his favor, and that the miller should be driven with shame from the court. After that the Tsar said to the orphan, "Didst thou hit upon these answers thyself, or did someone else tell thee?" "To tell the truth, they are not my own. The lovely damsel taught me these answers." "She has taught thee well too. Sage indeed must she be. Go to her and tell her in my name that if she be so wise and sensible, she must appear before me tomorrow, neither on foot nor on horseback, neither naked nor clothed, and with a present in her hand that is no gift. If she accomplish this, I will reward her as becomes a Tsar, and make her higher than the highest." Again the orphan went out of the town, and again he fell a-fretting, and he said to himself, "Why, I don't even know how, and have no idea where, to find this lovely damsel. What sort of a task is this that I am bidden to give her?" No sooner had he thought this than the sage and lovely damsel again passed by that way. The orphan told her how his guesses had pleased the Tsar, and how he wanted to see the damsel himself and have proof of her wisdom, and how he had promised to reward her. The damsel thought a bit, and then said to the orphan, "Fetch me a long bearded billy goat, and a big net for catching fish, and catch me a pair of sparrows. Tomorrow morning we'll meet here, and if I get a reward from the Tsar, I'll share it equally with thee." The orphan carried out the orders of the damsel, and waited for her next morning at the roadside. The damsel appeared, stripped off her sarafan, and wound herself in the long fishing net from head to foot. Then she sat on the goat, took a sparrow in each hand, and bade the orphan lead the way to town. The young man brought her to the Tsar at court, and she bowed low to the Tsar and said, "Behold, O sovereign Tsar, I come to thee neither on foot nor on horseback, neither naked nor clothed, and I have brought a present in my hand which is no gift." "Where is it?" asked the Tsar. "Here." And she gave the Tsar the live sparrows, and he was about to take them from her hands when the sparrows wriggled out and flew away. "Well," said the Tsar, "I see thou canst vie even with me in wit. Stay at my court and look after my children, and I'll give thee a rich recompense." "Nay, my sovereign lord and Tsar, I cannot accept thy gracious favor. I have promised this good youth to share my reward with him for his services. Look now, thou art witty and wise, but in this matter thy head is turned, and thou dost not judge according to reason. I offer thee a high and honorable place with a great recompense. Why then canst thou not share this reward with this youth?" "But how can I share it then?" "How, thou sage damsel? Why, if this good youth be dear to thee, marry him. For honor and recompense, and labor and sorrow, and bright-faced joy are shared by husband and wife half and half." "Thou too art wise, I see, O sovereign Tsar, and I'll gainsay thee no longer," said the lovely damsel. So she took the orphan for her husband, and though the orphan had no very great mind, his heart was simple and good, and he lived with his sage wife all his life in contentment and happiness. End of The Sage Damsel, recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. The Prophetic Dream, from Russian Fairy Tales by Peter Polevoi. Translated by Robert Nisbet Bain, 1854 to 1909. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. The Prophetic Dream. There was once upon a time a merchant, and he had 2 sons, Dmitri and Ivan. Once the father bade his sons good night, sent them off to bed, and said to them, "Now children, whatever you see in your dreams, tell it all to me tomorrow morning, and whichever of you hides his dream from me, no good thing will befall him." In the morning the elder son came to his father and said, "I dreamed, dear father, that my brother Ivan flew high into the sky on 20 eagles." "Very good," said the father, "and what didst thou dream, Vanya?" "Well, such rubbish, father, that it is impossible to tell it." "What dost thou mean? Speak." "No, I'll not." "Speak, boy, when I bid thee." "No, I won't speak, I won't." The father was very angry with his younger son, and resolved to punish him for his disobedience. So he sent for his overseers and bade them strip Ivan naked and tie him as tightly as possible to a post at the crossways. No sooner said than done. The overseers seized hold of him, dragged him far, far away from home to the crossways, where 7 roads crossed, tied him by the hands and feet to the post, and left him alone to his fate. The poor youth fared very badly. The sun scorched him, the gnats and flies sucked his blood, hunger and thirst tortured him. Fortunately for Ivan, a young Tsarevich happened to be going along one of these 7 roads. He saw the merchant's son, had compassion on him, and bade his attendants untie him from the post, dressed him in his own clothes, and saved him from a cruel death. The Tsarevich took Ivan to his court, gave him to eat and drink, and asked him who had tied him to the post. "My own father, who was angry with me." "And wherefore, pray? Surely thy fault was not small." "Well, in fact, I would not obey him. I would not tell him what I saw in my dreams." "And for such a trifle as that he condemned thee to so cruel a punishment? The villain! Surely he has outgrown his wits. But what then didst thou see in thy dream?" "I saw what I cannot even tell unto thee, O Tsarevich." "What? Not tell? Not tell me? Me, the Tsarevich? What? I saved thee from a cruel death, and thou wilt not do this trifle for me in return? Speak immediately, or it will not be well with thee." "Nay, Tsarevich, I stick to my word. I haven't told my father, and I'll not tell thee." The Tsarevich boiled over with unspeakable rage, and shrieked to his servants and attendants, "Hi! My faithful servants, take this good-for-nothing boor, put heavy irons on his hands, weld grievous fetters to his legs, and cast him into my deep dungeon." The servants did not think twice about their master's commands. They seized Ivan the merchant's son, loaded his hands and feet with fetters, and put him as God's slave in the stone sack. A little and a long time passed by, and the Tsarevich thought of marrying the thrice-wise Helena, the first maiden in the whole earth for beauty and wisdom. So he made ready and went into the strange country far away to marry this thrice-wise Helena. Now it happened that the day after he had gone, his sister the Tsarevna went walking in the garden, hard by the very same dungeon in which Ivan the merchant's son had been put. He saw the Tsarevna through the little grated window and cried to her with a lamentable voice, "Dear Mother Tsarevna, thy brother will never be married without my help." "Who art thou?" answered the Tsarevna. Ivan named his name and added, "I suppose thou hast heard, O Tsarevna, of the trickeries and the cunning wiles of the thrice-wise Helena? I have heard not once nor twice that she has expedited many wooers into another world. Believe me that thy brother also will not be able to marry her without me." "And thou art able to help the Tsarevich?" "Able and willing, but the falcon's wings are bound, and no way is found for him." The Tsarevna bade them release Ivan from his dungeon and gave him full liberty to do what was in his mind, so long only as he helped the Tsarevich to marry. And then Ivan the merchant's son chose him comrades first of all, one by one, and added youth to youth, and they were all as like to each other as if they had been born brothers. He dressed them in mantles of one kind, sewn in one and the same fashion. He mounted them on horses of one color and like each other to a hair, and they all mounted and rode away. 11 was the number of the young comrades of Ivan the merchant's son. They rode for one day, they rode for another day, and on the third day they entered a gloomy forest. And Ivan said to his comrades, "Stay, my brothers. There is here, on the verge of the precipice, an old tree, a hollow, branchless tree. I must look into its hollow trunk and find my fortune there." So he went to the tree he had described and plunged his hand into the hollow trunk and drew out of it an invisible cap, hid it in his bosom, and returned to his comrades. They came to the realm of the thrice-wise Helena, went straight into the capital, sought out the Tsarevich and begged him, "Take us into thy servant, O Tsarevich. We will serve thee with a single heart." The Tsarevich thought the matter over and said, "How can I help taking such gallant youths into my service? Perhaps in a strange land they may be of service to me." And to 11 of them he assigned their posts. He made one his equerry, another his cook, but Ivan he bade never to depart from his side. The next day the Tsarevich attired himself in festal raiment, and went forth to woo the thrice-wise Helena. She received him courteously, regaled him with all manner of rich meats and drinks, and then she said to the Tsarevich, "I don't at all mind being thy wife, but first of all thou must accomplish these tasks. If thou do them, I will be thy faithful wife, but if not, thy haughty head shall wag no more on thy stalwart shoulders." "Why be afraid before the time? Tell me thy tasks, thrice-wise Helena." "This then is my first task for thee. I shall have ready by tomorrow what I will not tell thee, and for what purpose I do not know. Show thy wit then, and bring me the fellow of it of thine own devising." The Tsarevich went home from the court by no means happy. His haughty head hung lower than his stalwart shoulders. And Ivan met him and said, "Have thy grief with me, O Tsarevich, and it will be better for thee." "Well, look now," said the Tsarevich, "Helena has set me a task that not a single wise man in the world could do." And he told Ivan all about it. "Well," said Ivan, "'tis not such a great matter after all. Pray to God and lie down to sleep. The morning is wiser than the evening. Tomorrow we'll consider the matter." The Tsarevich lay down to sleep, but Ivan the merchant's son put on his invisible cap, went as swiftly as possible to the palace, ran through all the chambers, and made his way right into the bedchamber of the thrice-wise Helena. And then he heard her giving these orders to her favorite servant, "Take this cloth of gold to my shoemaker, and let him make me shoes for my feet as soon as possible." The servant ran with all her might, and behind her ran Ivan. The cobbler set to work. The work seemed to burn his fingers, so quickly did he do it. He beat the stuff with his little hammer and stitched it with his needle. A little shoe was quickly ready, and he put it on the little windowsill. Ivan the merchant's son took the little shoe and hid it in his bosom. The shoemaker was in great consternation. What was the meaning of it? His work had vanished from before his eyes. He searched and searched. He rummaged in every corner, but it was all in vain. "What marvel is this?" thought he. "Can the unclean spirit, that is, the devil, be playing his tricks with me?" There was no help for it. He set to work again with his awl, finished the other slipper, and sent it by the servant maid to the thrice-wise Helena. But Ivan was after her again, crept like a shadow into the palace in his invisible cap, stood behind the shoulders of the thrice-wise Helena, and saw that she sat behind her little table and began to cover the slipper with gold, embroider it with large pearls, and set it thickly with precious stones. Ivan the merchant's son drew his own slipper out of his bosom and began to do the like with it. Whenever she took up a little gem, he chose out just such another. Wherever she threaded a pearl, he took another and sewed that on too. The thrice-wise Helena finished her work, looked at the slipper, and couldn't admire it enough. She smiled and thought to herself, "We will see what the Tsarevich will present himself with tomorrow morning." But Ivan the merchant's son awoke the Tsarevich very early the next morning, took the slipper from his bosom and gave it to him. "Go to thy lady and show her this slipper," said he. "There thou hast her first task." The Tsarevich washed and dressed himself, hastened to his lady, and found her apartments full of boyars and grandees, and her counselors were all assembled there down to the very last one. There was a noise of melody, there came a crash of lively music, the doors of the inner chambers were thrown open, and out came the thrice-wise Helena, sailing along like a white swan. She bowed on all sides, but particularly to the Tsarevich. Then she drew out of her pocket the shoe, set with large pearls and adorned with precious stones. And she looked at the Tsarevich with a mocking smile, and all the boyars, the grandees, and the counselors who were in the palace looked intently at the Tsarevich. And the Tsarevich said to the thrice-wise Helena, "Thy slipper is very fine, but 'tis no good at all unless it have a fellow." "Well, here it is, and I give thee the other, which is exactly like it." And he drew out of his pocket the slipper and placed it by the side of the other one. The whole palace heaved a great "Oh!" The boyars, grandees, and counselors exclaimed with one voice, "Thou art indeed worthy, O Tsarevich, to wed our Tsarevna, the thrice-wise Helena." "Not so quick, please," cried the Tsarevna. "Let us see what he'll make of the second task. I shall await thee tomorrow in this self-same place, Tsarevich, and this is my task for thee. I shall have an unexplainable somewhat, disguised in feathers and in stones. Bring thou also just such another unknown, somewhat disguised in just such feathers and stones." The Tsarevich bowed and went out, looking much blacker than the evening before. "Well," thought he, "now indeed my shoulders will not support my head very much longer." And again Ivan the merchant's son met him and consoled him with a friendly smile. "Come, Tsarevich, wherefore grieve? Pray to God and lie down to sleep. The morning is wiser than the evening." Ivan made the Tsarevich lie down, then quickly took his invisible cap, darted into the palace, and arrived just in time to hear the Tsarevna give this command to her favorite servant: "Go into the fowl yard and bring me hither a duck." Off went the servant to the fowl yard, and Ivan after her. He put a duck under her arm, but Ivan hid a drake in his bosom, and they came back the same way. The thrice-wise Helena again sat down at her little table, took the duck, adorned its wings with ribbons and its little tail with amethysts, and fastened a necklace of pearls round its neck. And Ivan saw it all, and did just the same to his drake. The next day the Tsarevich again went up to the palace, and again all the boyars and grandees were assembled there. Again there was a crash of music, and the doors of the inner chambers opened, and the thrice-wise Helena came forth, strutting along like a peahen. Behind her came the maids of honor, bearing a golden dish, and they all saw that upon this dish, beneath the white cloth, some living thing was moving about. Softly, very softly, the Tsarevna raised the cloth from the dish, took out the duck, and said to the Tsarevich, "Well, didst thou guess my riddle?" "How could I help guessing it?" replied the Tsarevich. "There's nothing so very knowing in such a task as that." And forthwith he put his hand into his cap and drew out his dressed-up drake. All the boyars and grandees cried, "Oh!" and with one voice exclaimed, "Well done, young hero Tsarevich! Thou art indeed worthy to take Helena the thrice-wise to wife." But Helena the thrice-wise knit her brows and said, "Stop a bit. Let him first fulfill my third task. If he be such a hero, let him fetch me 3 hairs from the head and 3 hairs from the beard of my grandfather the Sea King, and then I am ready to be his wife." The Tsarevich returned home, gloomier than an autumn night. He would look at nothing and speak to nobody. "Don't fret, Tsarevich," whispered Ivan the merchant's son in his ear. And he seized his invisible cap and was in the palace in a trice, and saw the thrice-wise Helena sitting in her state coach and preparing to drive to the blue sea. And our Ivan, in his invisible cap, took his seat in the very carriage, and the fiery horses of the Tsar carried them in hot haste to the blue sea. So the thrice-wise Helena arrived at the blue sea, sat under a rock by the shore on a large stone, turned her face to the blue sea, and began to call her dear granddad, the Sea King. The blue sea boiled as in a storm, and despite a great calm, the depths of the sea were disturbed by a huge wave. A crest of silvery foam worked its way up, rolled along the shore as if caressing it, broke up gradually on the golden beach, scattering crystal jets and pearly shells on the shore. And there rose out of the water, up to the waist, the old grandfather. On his head masses of grey locks sparkled like silver in the sun, dripping wet, and great tufts of hair hung over his brows. But his face was covered with a thick golden beard like moss. He rode up to the breast in a broad big wave, which swept over his shoulders and hid his body to the waist. The ocean grandfather leaned against a stone with his goose-like paws, looked with his green eyes into the eyes of the thrice-wise Helena, and cried, "Hail, granddaughter of my desires! 'Tis a long time since I have seen thee. 'Tis a long time since thou hast visited me. And now, please, comb my little head for me." And he leaned his unkempt head against the knee of his granddaughter and dozed off into a sweet sleep. But the thrice-wise Helena began smoothing her grandfather's hair and winding his grey locks round her fingers to curl them, and whispering soft words in her grandfather's ear, and lulling him to sleep with gentle songs. And as soon as she saw that her grandfather was asleep, she tugged 3 silver hairs out of his head. But Ivan the merchant's son, slipping his hand below hers, wrenched out a whole handful. The grandfather awoke, looked at his granddaughter and said sleepily, "Art thou mad? It hurts me horribly." "Pardon, dear grandfather," said the thrice-wise Helena, "but it's such a long time since I did thy hair that it is quite tangled." But the grandfather did not hear her to the end. He was already snoring, and shortly afterward the Tsarevna pulled 3 golden hairs out of his beard. Ivan the merchant's son thought, "I must have some of that too," seized the grandfather by the beard and tore out a good piece of it. The sea grandfather roared aloud, awoke from his sleep, and dived into the depths like a bucket. Only bubbles remained behind. Next day the Tsarevna entered the palace and thought, "The Tsarevich really will fall into my clutches now." And she showed the Tsarevich the 3 golden hairs and the 3 silver ones. "Well, Tsarevich, hast managed to pick up such wonderful things as these?" "Well, Tsarevna, that is little to boast of. Why, I'll give thee whole handfuls of such stuff if thou wilt." And the whole palace resounded with cries of amazement when the Tsarevich drew from his breast the grandfather's hairs. The thrice-wise Helena was very wroth. She rushed off to her bedroom, looked into her magic books, and saw that it was not the Tsarevich who was so knowing, but his favorite servant, Ivan the merchant's son. She returned to her guests and said, in soft and wheedling tones, "Thou hast not guessed my riddles and done my task of thine own self alone, Tsarevich, but thy favorite servant Ivan has helped thee. I should like to look at the good youth. Bring him to me quickly." "I have not 1 servant, but 12 servants, Tsarevna." "Then bring him hither whose name is Ivan." "They are all called Ivan." "Then bid them all come," said she. But she thought to herself, "I'll pick out the guilty one, I know." The Tsarevich sent for his servants, and the 12 youths appeared at court. They were all of one face and one stature, their voices were all alike, and there was not a hair's difference between them. "Which among you is the biggest?" And they all cried with a loud voice, "I am the biggest, I am the biggest." "Well," thought Helena, "I can't catch you this way, but I'll manage it somehow." And she bade them bring 11 common drinking cups, but the 12th of pure gold. She filled the drinking cups full of good wine, and gave them to the good youths to drink. But not one of them would look at the common cups, and all stretched out their hands toward the golden cup. So in struggling for it, they only made a great clamor, and all the wine was spilled. The Tsarevna perceived that her artifice had failed, So she invited all the servants of the Tsarevich to pass the night at the palace. All the evening she gave them as much as they could eat and drink, and then she gave them soft, downy beds to lie upon. And when all the good youths were sound asleep, the thrice-wise Helena came to them in their bedroom, looked into her magic book, and immediately discovered which of them was Ivan the merchant's son. Then she drew out her penknife and cut off the lock of hair over his left temple, and she thought to herself, "By that mark I shall know you in the morning and have you punished." But in the morning Ivan the merchant's son awoke before them all, clapped his hand to his head, and saw that he was shorn of his lock. He immediately rose from his bed and woke all his comrades. "Quick, my brothers, take your knives and shear off your locks." In an hour's time they were summoned to the presence of the thrice-wise Helena. The Tsarevna looked and saw that all of them had their locks shorn off. Full of rage, she seized her magic book, threw it into the fire, called the Tsarevich to her and said to him, "I'll be thy wife, make ready for the wedding." And the Tsarevich sent for his good youths and said to Ivan, "Go to my sister and bid her make ready everything for the wedding." Ivan went to the Tsarevna, told her of her brother, and gave her his command. "I thank thee, thou good youth and faithful servant, for thy services," said the Tsarevich's sister to Ivan. "But say now, how shall I reward thee?" "How shalt thou reward me?" answered Ivan the merchant's son. "Why, bid them put me again in my old dungeon." And do what the Tsarevna would to dissuade him, he insisted upon it. The Tsarevich and his bride arrived, and the boyars, the grandees, and the festal guests came out to meet them, wished them health and happiness, and presented them with bread and salt. And there were so many people pressed together that you could have walked on their heads. "But where is my faithful servant Ivan?" asked the Tsarevich. "How is it I do not see him here?" The Tsarevna answered him, "Thou thyself hadst him put into a dungeon because of a certain dream." "What? Surely this is never the same youth?" "It's the very same. I only let him out for a time to go and help thee." The Tsarevich bade them bring Ivan to him, threw himself on his neck, burst into tears, and begged him not to think evil of him. "But dost thou know, O Tsarevich," said Ivan, "that I did not tell thee this dream of mine, because I saw beforehand in my slumbers all that has now happened to thee. Judge now thyself and tell me, wouldst thou not have thought me half mad if I had told thee all?" And the Tsarevich rewarded Ivan and made him the greatest in the realm after himself. But Ivan wrote to his father and his brother, and they all lived together and had no end of good things, and lived happily ever after. 2. Out of the knapsack. There was once an old man whose wife was exceedingly quarrelsome. The old man had no rest from her day or night. She nagged and nagged at him for every little trifle. But if the old man ventured to gainsay her in anything, she immediately caught up a broomstick or something else and chased him out of the kitchen. The old man had only one consolation. He would leave his old wife and go into the fields to set snares and bird traps, hang them up on the branches of all the trees, and entice into his snares every bird that God has made. And so he would bring home a great booty, and give his old wife enough to last her for a whole day, or even two. And then he would for once enjoy a day in peace. One day he went out into the fields and set his snares, and caught in them a crane. "What a stroke of luck," thought the old man. "When I take home this crane to my old wife and we kill and roast it, she won't abuse me for a long time." But the crane guessed his thoughts and said to him with a human voice, "Don't take me home and kill me, but let me go and live at liberty as before. Thou shalt be dearer to me than my own father, and I will be as good as a son to thee." The old man was amazed at these words and let the crane go. But when he returned home with empty hands, the old woman nagged at him so frightfully that he dared not go into the house, but passed the night in the courtyard beneath the staircase. Very early in the morning he went out into the fields, and was just about to lay his snares when he saw the crane of the evening before coming toward him, holding in its long beak a sort of knapsack. "Yesterday," said the crane, "thou didst set me free, and today I bring thee a little gift. Say thanks for it. Just look at it." It placed the knapsack on the ground and cried, "Two out of the knapsack!" And whence I know not, but out of the knapsack leaped two youths, who brought oaken tables, covered them with dishes, and set on them flesh and fowl of every description. The old man ate his fill of such delicacies, as it had never been his luck to see all his life, even from afar. He ate and drank without stopping, and would only rise from the table when the crane cried, "Two into the knapsack." And the tables with all the flesh and fowl were as if they had never been. "Take this knapsack," said the crane, "and give it to thy old wife." The old man thanked him and went home, but all at once the desire seized him to brag about his booty to his godmother. So he went to his godmother, inquired after the healths of herself and her 3 daughters, and said, "Give me a little supper, according as God has blessed thee." The godmother put before him what was on the stove, curtsied, and bade him fall to. But the godson turned up his nose and said to the godmother, "Thine is sorry fare. Why, I have as good as that when I'm on the road. I'll give a supper to thee." "Very well, do so." The old man immediately brought out his knapsack, placed it on the ground, and the moment he cried, "Two out of the knapsack," 2 youths, whence they came I know not, leaped out of the knapsack, placed the oaken tables, covered them with carved dishes, and set upon them all sorts of flesh and fowl, such as the godmother had never seen from the day of her birth. The godmother and her daughters ate and drank their fill, and her thoughts were not good. She meant to deprive her godson of his knapsack by subtlety. And she began flattering her godson, and said to him, "My dear little dovey godson, thou art tired today. Wilt thou now stop and have a bath? We have everything handy to warm the bathroom for thee." The godson did not say no to a bath, hung up his knapsack in the hut, and went into the bathroom to bathe. But the godmother immediately bade her daughters sew together in hot haste just such another knapsack as the old man's. And when they had finished it, she foisted her knapsack on the old man, and took his knapsack for herself. The old man noticed nothing, and went home cheerily cheerful. He sang songs and whistled all the way. And no sooner did he get home than he cried to his old wife, "Wife, wife, congratulate me upon the gift which I have got from the son of the crane." The old woman looked at him and thought, "You've been drinking somewhere today, I know. I'll give you a lesson." The old man, when he had got into the hut, immediately placed his knapsack in the middle of the floor and cried, "Two out of the knapsack." But out of the knapsack came nobody at all. A second time he cried, "Two out of the knapsack," and again there was nobody. The old woman, when she saw this, let loose the full flood of her abuse upon him, flew at him like a whirlwind, caught up a wet mop on her way, and it was as much as he could do to escape from her and dash out of the hut. The poor fellow fell a-weeping, and went to the self-same spot in the fields, thinking, "Perhaps I may meet the crane, and get another such knapsack from him." And indeed the crane was there, and was waiting for the old man with just such another knapsack. "Here is just such another knapsack, and it will be of as good service as the former one." The old man bowed to the very girdle, and ran off home at full speed. But on the way a doubt occurred to him. "If now this knapsack be not quite the same as the other one, I shall get into trouble again with my old wife, and this time I shall not be able to hide my head from her even under the ground. Come along then. Two out of the knapsack." Immediately 2 young men leaped out of the knapsack with long sticks in their hands, and began to belabor him, crying, "Don't go to thy godmother! Don't be fooled by honeyed words!" And they kept on beating the old man till he bethought himself to say, "Two into the knapsack." Then the young men hid themselves in the knapsack. "Well," thought the old man, "I praised the other knapsack to my godmother like a fool, but I shall not be a fool if I praise this to her also. I wonder if she would like to cozen this one from me also. She'd thank me little this time." So he went quite cheerily to his godmother, hung up the knapsack on the wall, and said, "Pray, heat me a bath, godmother." "With pleasure, godson." The old man got into the bath and had a good wash, staying as long as he could. The godmother called her daughters, placed them behind the table, and said, "Two out of the knapsack." And out of the knapsack leaped the young men with the long sticks, and began beating the godmother and crying, "Give the old man back his knapsack." The godmother sent her eldest daughter to the old man and said, "Call our godson out of the bath. Say that these 2 are beating me to death." But the godson replied out of the bath, "I have not finished bathing yet." The godmother sent her youngest daughter, but the godson replied out of the bath, "I have not washed my head yet." But the 2 youths kept beating the godmother all the time, and saying, "Give back the old man's knapsack." The godmother's patience was quite tired out, and she bade her daughters bring the stolen knapsack and throw it to the old man in the bathroom. Then the old man got out of his bath and cried, "Two into the knapsack," and the young men with the long sticks were no more. Then the old man took both the knapsacks and went home. He approached the house and again began crying, "Congratulate me, wife, on the gifts I have got from the son of the crane." The old woman flared up at once and got her broom ready. But the old man, when he came in, cried, "Two out of the knapsack!" And immediately the tables appeared before the old woman, and the two young men placed on the tables flesh and fowl in abundance. The old woman ate and drank her fill and became quite mild and tender. "Well, dear little hubby, I'll thwack thee no more." But the old man after dinner took this knapsack and put it away, and unexpectedly got out the other and placed it on the bench in the hut. The old woman wanted to see for herself how the old man's knapsack set to work, so she cried, "Two out of the knapsack!" Immediately the two young men with the long sticks popped out and fell to beating the old woman, crying all the time, "Don't beat thy old man! Don't abuse thy old man!" The old woman screeched with all her might and called to her old man to help her. The old man took pity on her, came into the hut and said, "Two into the knapsack," and the two disappeared into the knapsack. Henceforth the old man and the old woman lived together in such peace and quietness that the old man is always praising his old wife to the skies, and so this story ends. End of Two Out of the Knapsack. The story of Marko the Rich and Vasily the Luckless. Not in our time, but a long time ago, in a certain realm, lived a very rich merchant, Marko by name, and surnamed the Rich. Cruel and hard was he by nature, greedy of lucre and unmerciful to the poor. Whenever the lowly and the needy came begging beneath his window, he sent his servants to drive them away, and let loose his dogs upon them. There was only one thing in the world he loved, and that was his daughter, the thrice fair Anastasia. To her only he was not hard, and though she was only 5 years old, he never gainsaid her one of her wishes, and gave her all her heart's desire. And once on a cold, frosty day, 3 gray-haired men came under the window and asked an alms. Marko saw them and ordered the dogs to be let loose. The thrice fair Anastasia heard of it and implored her father and said, "My dear own father, for my sake don't drive them away, but let them pass the night in the cattle stall." The father consented and bade them let the poor old beggarmen into the cattle stall for the night. As soon as everyone was asleep, Anastasia rose up, made her way on tiptoe to the stall, climbed up into the loft and looked at the beggars. The old beggarmen were crouching together in the middle of the stall, leaning on their crutch staves with their wrinkled hands, and over their hands flowed their gray beards, and they were talking softly among themselves. One of the old men, the eldest of the 3, looked at the others and said, "What news from the wide world?" The second one immediately replied, "In the village Pogoryeloye, in the house of Ivan the Luckless, a 7th son is born. What shall we call him, and with what inheritance shall we bless him?" And the third old man, after meditating a little, said, "We'll call him Vasily, and we'll enrich him with the riches of Marko the Rich, under whose roof we are now passing the night." When they had thus said, they prepared to depart, bowed low to the holy icons, and with soft footsteps departed from the stall. Anastasia heard all this, went straight to her father, and told him the words of the old men. Marko the Rich thought deeply over it. He thought, and he went to the village Pogoryeloye. "I'll find out for certain," thought he, "whether such a babe really has been born there." He went straight to the priest and told him all about it. "Yes," replied the priest, "yesterday we had a babe born here, the son of our poorest serf. I christened him Vasily, and luckless he certainly is. He is the 7th son in the family, and the eldest son of the family is only 7 years old. The sons of this poor peasant are wee little things. There is next to nothing to eat and drink there, and such hunger and want is in the house that there's none in the village who will even stand sponsor." At this news, the heart of Marko the Rich began to ache. Marko thought of the unhappy youngster, declared he would be godfather, asked the priest's wife to be godmother, and bade them make ready a rich table. And they brought the little fellow, christened him, and sat down and feasted. At the banquet, Marko the Rich spoke friendly words to Ivan the Luckless, and said to him, "Gossip, thou art a poor man, and cannot afford to bring up thy son. Give him to me. I will bring him up among well-to-do people, and I will give into thy hand at once for thine own maintenance 1,000 rubles." The poor man thought the matter over, and then shook hands upon it. Marko gave gifts to his fellow sponsor, took the child, wrapped him in fox furs, put him in his carriage and drove homeward. They had got some 10 versts from the village when Marko stopped the horses, took up the child, went to the brink of a great precipice, whirled the child over his head, and pitched it down the precipice, exclaiming, "There you go, and now take possession of my goods if you can." Shortly after that, some merchants from beyond the sea chanced to be traveling by the selfsame road. These merchants brought with them 12,000 rubles, which they owed to Marko the rich. They passed along by the side of the precipice, and they heard within the precipice the crying of a child. They stopped their horses, went to the precipice, and looked among the snowdrifts of the green meadows. And on the meadow a little child was sitting and playing with flowers. The merchants took up the child, wrapped him round with furs, and went on their way. They came to the house of Marko the rich, and told him of their strange discovery. Marko immediately guessed that the matter concerned his own little serf boy, and he said to the merchants, "I should very much like to look at your foundling. If you will give him to me out and out, I'll forgive you your debt to me." The merchants agreed, gave the child to Marko, and departed. But Marko that same night took the child, put it in a little cask, tarred it all over, and threw it into the sea. The cask sailed and sailed along, and at last it came to a monastery. The monks happened to be on the shore just then. They were spreading out their fishing nets to dry, and all at once they heard the crying of a child. They guessed that the crying came from the cask, and they immediately seized the cask, broke it open, and there was the babe. They took him to the abbot, and as soon as the abbot heard that the child had been cast upon the shore in a cask, he decided that the youngster's name should be Vasily, and that he should be surnamed the Luckless. And henceforth Vasily lived in the monastery till he was 16 years old, and he grew up fair of face, soft of heart, and strong in mind. The abbot loved him because he learned his letters so quickly that he was able to read and sing in the church better than all the others, and because he was deft and skillful in affairs. And the abbot made him sacristan. And it happened that once Marko the rich was traveling on business, and came to this very monastery. The monks treated him with honor as a rich guest. The abbot commanded the sacristan to run and open the church. The sacristan ran at once, lit the candles, and remained in the choir and read and sang. And Marko the rich asked the abbot if the young man had dwelt there long, and the abbot told him all about it. Marko began to think, and it struck him that this could be no other than his serf boy. And he said to the abbot, "Would that I could lay my hands upon such a smart young fellow as your sacristan. I would place all my treasures beneath his care. I would make him the chief overseer of all my goods, and you know yourselves what goods are mine." The abbot began to make excuses, but Marko promised the monastery a donation of 10,000 rubles. The abbot wavered. He began to consult the brothers, and the brothers said to him, "Why should we stand in Vasily's way? Let Marko the rich take him and make him his overseer." So they deliberated and agreed to send away Vasily the Luckless with Marko the rich. But Marko sent Vasily home in a ship, and wrote to his wife as follows: "When the bearer of this letter reaches thee, go with him at once to our soapworks, and when thou dost pass the great boiling cauldron, push him in. If thou dost not do this, I will punish thee severely, for this youth is my prime enemy and evil doer." Vasily duly arrived in port, and went on his way. And there met him in the road 3 poor old men, and they asked him, "Whither art thou going, Vasily the Luckless?" "Why, to the house of Marko the rich. I have a letter for his wife." "Show us the letter," said the old men. Vasily took out the letter and gave it them. The old men breathed on the letter and said, "Go now, and give the letter to the wife of Marko the rich. God will not forsake thee." Vasily came to the house of Marko the rich and gave the letter to his wife. The wife read Marko's letter and called her daughter, for she could not believe her own eyes. But in the letter was written as plain could be, "Wife, the next day after thou dost receive this my letter, marry my daughter Anastasia to the bearer, and do so without delay. If thou dost it not, thou shalt answer to me for it." Anastasia looked at Vasily, and Vasily stared at her. And they dressed Vasily in rich attire, and the next day they wedded him to Anastasia. Marko the rich came home from the sea, and his wife with his daughter and son-in-law met him on the quay. Marko looked at Vasily, fell into a furious passion with his wife and said to her, "How darest thou wed our daughter away without my consent?" But the wife replied, "I dared not disobey thy strict command." And she gave the threatening letter to her husband. Marco read the letter and saw that the handwriting was his own, if the intention was not, and he thought to himself, "Good! Thrice hast thou escaped ruin at my hands, but now I will send thee where not even the ravens shall pick thy bones." Marco lived for a month with his son-in-law and treated him and his daughter most kindly. From his face, nobody could have thought that he nourished evil thoughts against him in his heart. One day Marco called Vasily to him and said to him, "Go to the land of thrice 9 in the empire of thrice 10, to Tsar Zimi. 12 years ago he built a palace on my land. Do thou therefore obtain rent from him for all the 12 years, and get news from him concerning my 12 ships, which have been wrecked about his kingdom for the last 3 years, and have left no trace behind them." Vasily dared not gainsay his father-in-law, but prepared for his journey, took leave of his young wife, took a sack of sweetmeats as provision by the way, and set out. He went on, and whether it was long or short, far or near, matters not. But at last he heard a voice which said, "Vasily the luckless, whither art thou going? Is thy journey far?" Vasily looked around him on all sides and answered, "Who called me? Speak." "'Tis I, the old leafless oak, and I ask thee, whither art thou going, and is thy journey far?" "I am going to Zarzmi to collect arrears of rent for the last 12 years." And again the oak said to him, "If thou arrivest in time, think of me, and say that here the old leafless oak has been standing all these 300 years, and is withered and rotten to the very root. How much longer must he be tormented in this wide world?" Vasily listened attentively, and then went farther. He came to a river and sat in the ferry boat, but the old ferryman looked at him and said, "Is thy journey before thee a long one, Vasily the luckless?" Vasily told him. "Well," said the ferryman, "if thou art in time, remember me, and say to him I have been ferrying here all these 30 years. How much longer, I should like to know, must I go backward and forward?" "Good," said Vasily, "I will say so." He went on to the straits of the sea, and across the straits a whalefish was lying stretched out, and a road marked out by posts went across its back, and people passed to and fro there. When Vasily stepped onto the whalefish spoke to him with a man's voice and said, "Whither art thou going, Vasily the luckless, and is thy journey far?" Vasily told it everything, and the whalefish said again, "If thou art in time, remember me. The poor whalefish has been lying across the sea these 3 years, and a road marked out by posts goes across its back, and horse and foot trample into its very ribs, and it has no rest night or day. How much longer, pray, is it to lie here?" "Good," said Vasily, "I will say so," and went on further. Vasily went on, and he came to a broad green meadow. In the meadow stood a gigantic palace. The white marble walls glistened, the roof shone like a rainbow, and was covered with mother of pearl, and the crystal windows burned like fire in the sun. Vasily entered the palace. He went from room to room, and marveled at the indescribable wealth of them. He went into the last room of all, and saw a lovely damsel sitting on a bed. When she saw Vasily, she cried, "Is it Vasily the luckless that has fallen into this accursed place?" Vasily told her everything, and why he had come, and what had befallen him on the way. And the damsel said to Vasily, "Not to take tribute wast thou sent here, but as food for the serpent, and to thine own destruction." Scarcely had she spoken these words than the whole palace trembled, and there was a clanging and banging in the courtyard. The damsel hid Vasily in a coffer beneath the floor, locked him in, and whispered, "Listen to what I say to the serpent." And with that she went to meet Tsar Serpent. A monstrous serpent rolled into the room and straightway got onto the bed and said, "I have been flying over the Russian land. I'm very tired and I want to go to sleep." The lovely damsel flattered him and said, "Everything is known to thee, O Tsar, and without thee I cannot interpret a very hard dream I have dreamed. Wilt thou interpret it for me?" "Well, out with it, quick." "I dreamt I was going along a road, and an oak tree cried to me, 'Ask the Tsar how long I am to stand here.' 'It will stand till someone comes and kicks it with his foot, and then it will be rooted out and fall, and beneath it is a great quantity of gold and silver. Marco the rich himself has not got as much.' But then I dreamed that I came to a river,
And the ferryman on the ferryboat said to me, "Shall I ferry here long?" "'Tis his own fault. Let him put the first who comes to him on the ferryboat, and push him with the ferryboat away from the shore, and he will change places with him and ferry forevermore." And after that I came in my dreams to the sea, and crossed over it on a whalefish, and it said to me, "Ask the Tsar how long I am to be here." "He must lie there till he has cast up the 12 ships of Marco the Rich, when he may go into the water, and his body will grow again." All this the serpent said, and then turned over on its other side, and fell a-snoring so loudly that all the crystal windows in the palace rattled. Then the damsel let Vasily out of the coffer, opened the garden gate for him, and showed him the way. Vasily thanked her, and began his return journey. He came to the straits of the sea, where the whalefish lay, and the whalefish asked, "Did he say anything about me?" "Take me over to the other side, and I'll tell thee." When he had crossed over, he said to the whalefish, "Thou must bring up again the 12 ships of Marco the Rich, which thou swallowed 3 years ago." The whalefish cleared its throat and brought up again all the ships quite whole, and not a bit hurt, and in his joy leaped about so in the water that Vasily the Luckless, who was standing on the bank, suddenly found himself up to his knees in the sea. He went on farther and came to the ferry. "Hast thou spoken about me to Tsar Serpent?" asked the ferryman. "I have. Ferry me over first, and I'll tell thee." And as soon as he had crossed over, he said to the ferryman, "Whoever comes to thee after me, seat him in the ferryboat and shove him from the bank, and he will have to ferry in thy place for ever and ever, but thou wilt be as free as the air." After that, Vasily came to the old leafless oak, kicked it with his foot, and the oak rolled over, and the roots sprang out of the ground, and beneath the roots and beneath the stump there was gold and silver and precious stones without number. Vasily looked about him, and lo, up to the very place were sailing the 12 ships of Marco the Rich, the self-same which the whalefish had brought up. And in the foremost ship, in the very stern, stood the self-same old men who had met Vasily when he had the letter to Marco the Rich and saved him from destruction. And the old men said to Vasily, "Dost thou not see, Vasily, how the Lord has blessed thee?" And they got off the ship and went their way. And the sailors put all the gold and silver in the ships and went home by sea. Marco the Rich was more furious than ever. He bade them saddle his horse and hastened off to Tsar Serpent in the land of Thrice 10. He wanted to arrange matters with Tsar Serpent himself. When he came to the river, he got onto the ferryboat, but the ferryman pushed him away from the shore, and there Marco remained as ferryman ever after, and there he is ferrying still. But Vasily the Luckless lived with his wife and mother-in-law, and was happy and prosperous and kind to the poor, and gave them meat and drink and clothed them, and disposed of all the wealth of Marco the Rich. End of Russian Fairy Tales by Peter Polevoi, translated by Robert Nisbet Bain, 1854 to 1909.